Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where the quietest stories are often the ones that travel the farthest. Imagine the North Atlantic in February, not the postcard version, not summer light on calm blue water. The February Atlantic is something else entirely. It is grey and heavy and vast in a way that is hard to fully hold in your mind. The swells roll in long, slow columns, dark green beneath and white at the tops where the wind catches them. The horizon disappears into low cloud. The air smells like salt and cold iron. There is nothing out there for hundreds of miles in any direction. And then, sometimes, in the middle of all that nothing, something appears that should not be there at all. That is roughly what happened on the 14th of February 2020 off the southwest coast of Ireland. The Irish naval vessel LE Samuel Beckett was on routine patrol in the North Atlantic, working the kind of long, unglamorous stretches that naval vessels do, monitoring waters, watching for vessels in distress, the slow and necessary work of maritime presence. The weather was rough. February in the Eastern Atlantic is rarely gentle, and somewhere out there, at approximately 700 nautical miles west of the Irish coast, the crew of the Samuel Beckett spotted something on the water that did not quite make sense. A large vessel, a cargo ship by the look of it. Dark hull, rusted sides, sitting low in the water. No navigation lights, no AIS signal. That is the automatic identification system that ships use to broadcast their position and identity to other vessels and to maritime authorities. Nothing on the radio, no movement on deck, no sign of anyone aboard at all. The Samuel Beckett attempted contact. Radio calls went unanswered. There was no response of any kind. The ship simply sat there in the Atlantic swells, drifting slowly, enormous and silent and completely alone. The vessel was the MV Alta. It was 77 metres long, built in 1976, and it had not had a living crew member aboard for more than 14 months. There is something about a story like this that takes a moment to settle in. We are not talking about legend here, or folklore, or a tale passed down through generations of sailors until no one is quite sure what is true and what has been embellished. This is a documented, verified, modern event. There are naval records, there are photographs, there is drone footage, there are Irish government statements and maritime investigation reports. The MV Alta drifted across the Atlantic Ocean, alone, for over a year, and eventually came to rest on the rocky shore of a small Irish fishing village, and the world looked up from whatever it was doing and said, quietly, "That is extraordinary." Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you at home, somewhere warm, with a cup of something nearby? Or are you somewhere else entirely? Maybe lying in bed in the dark or sitting by a window watching rain? What time is it where you are, I ask, because this kind of story, I think, lands differently, depending on where you are when you hear it. There is something about a ghost ship drifting through winter seas that feels different at 2 a.m. than it does at noon. It is the kind of story that the night seems to understand better. If you're enjoying this already, and you find yourself wanting to come back for more stories like this one, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps, and it lets us keep making these long, careful, unhurried explorations of the strange and quietly remarkable things that happen in the world. No pressure at all, but if this is your kind of thing, we would love to have you here. Now. Back to the Atlantic, and to a ship that had no business being where it was. The coastline of County Cork in the south of Ireland is not a gentle landscape. It is dramatic in the way that Atlantic-facing coasts tend to be. Cliffs dropping straight into churning water, small harbours tucked into rocky inlets, villages that have been watching the sea for centuries with a kind of practised wariness. The people who live along that coast know what the ocean can do. They have seen wrecks, they have heard the stories. But even by the standards of a coastline with a long memory, what washed up near Ballycotton in February 2020 was unusual. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The story of the MV Alta does not begin in Ireland. It begins much earlier and much farther away, in the warm waters of the Mediterranean, with a ship that was already old and tired and carrying a cargo of crushed stone toward a destination it would never reach. To understand how a ship ends up drifting alone across the Atlantic for over a year, you have to understand a few things. You have to understand what kind of ship the Alta was, what it was doing, and what happened to it out there in the open ocean. You have to understand something about maritime law and about the way that global shipping works, the invisible, unglamorous machinery that moves goods around the world, mostly without anyone noticing, mostly without anything going wrong. And you have to understand something about the ocean itself, about the way water moves and currents flow, and how a dead ship with no engine and no crew and no guidance can still travel thousands of miles. We will get to all of that. But right now, standing on the deck of the L.E. Samuel Beckett in February 2020, looking out across grey Atlantic water at a dark and silent hull, the immediate question is simpler than any of that. What is this ship, and how did it get here? The crew of the Samuel Beckett would have seen the Alta from a distance first. At 77 metres, it is not a small vessel. To put that in some perspective, 77 metres is roughly the length of 2.5 standard semi-trailer trucks lined up end to end, or about as long as a modest apartment building is tall. It is large enough to be unmistakable on the water, large enough that you would not mistake it for a fishing boat or a small pleasure craft. It is a working ship. Or it was. From a distance, the Alta would have looked wrong in the way that something looks wrong when it is in a place it should not be. Ships in the open Atlantic are not supposed to be stationary. They are supposed to be moving purposefully from one place to another. They are supposed to have lights, signals, a presence on the radio. A ship that is simply sitting there, dark and quiet in the middle of the ocean. That is not normal. That is the kind of thing that makes experienced sailors pay attention. The Samuel Beckett closed the distance. The Alta grew larger, and the more the crew could see, the stranger it looked. The hull was heavily rusted, deep orange-brown streaks running down the dark sides, the kind of rust that accumulates over years of hard use, and more recently over months of sitting exposed to seawater and salt air with no maintenance at all. The paint was worn and peeling, the decks were empty, no movement anywhere, no lights, no sound except the wind and the water. Radio contact was attempted again. Nothing. The Samuel Beckett circled the vessel looking for any sign of life. There was none. A decision was made to send a boarding party across. This is where the story of the MV Alta stops being an abstract maritime curiosity and becomes something more immediate and more human. Because boarding an unknown, unresponsive vessel in Atlantic swells is not a simple or comfortable thing. It requires a small inflatable craft, and it requires personnel willing to climb from that small inflatable craft onto the side of a large, rusted, possibly unstable ship, in rough water with no idea what they're going to find inside. The boarding party from the Samuel Beckett made their way across. They climbed aboard the Alta, and what they found inside was the kind of thing that is difficult to describe without slipping into the language of ghost stories, except that it was entirely real and entirely documented. The ship was empty. No crew. No one in the wheelhouse. No one in the cabins. No one in the engine room. But there were signs of habitation, personal belongings left behind, some food, the traces of 14 people who had lived aboard this vessel, and then, at some point, were no longer there. The cargo of aggregate crushed stone was still in the hold, undisturbed. The ship was taking on some water in places where the hull had weakened. It was structurally compromised but still improbably floating. The Irish Navy had just boarded a ghost ship. That phrase, ghost ship, would appear in headlines around the world over the following days. And it is worth pausing on it for a moment, because it is one of those terms that carries a lot of weight. Ghost ships have a long history in maritime legend. The Mary Celeste, found drifting in the Atlantic in 1872 with no crew and no explanation. The Flying Dutchman, the mythological vessel condemned to sail forever. There is something deep in human imagination that finds the idea of a crewless ship profoundly unsettling. A vessel that should require human presence and human purpose, continuing to exist without either. But the Alta is not a mystery in that sense. There is no supernatural explanation here, no vanished crew with no trace. The story of how this ship came to be drifting alone in the Atlantic is, once you follow it back to the beginning, a very human story. A story about an engine failure, and a rescue operation, and a shipping company that walked away from its responsibilities, and an ocean that is far more powerful and far less interested in human problems than we sometimes remember. What makes the Alta remarkable is not that it is unexplained. What makes it remarkable is that it is entirely explainable, and yet still somehow astonishing. 14 months, 3,000 miles give or take, no engine, no crew, no guidance of any kind. Just a 77-metre cargo ship built in 1976, carrying a load of crushed stone drifting across one of the world's most unpredictable and demanding stretches of ocean, and surviving it. The story of how that happened begins in September 2018 in the Mediterranean, with a departure from Crete that nobody at the time had any reason to think would end the way it did. Before we get into that departure from Crete, it is worth spending a little time with the ship itself. Because the Alta is not just a vessel that drifted across an ocean. It is a specific object with a specific history, and understanding what kind of ship it was helps explain a great deal about how its story unfolded the way it did. The MV Alta was a general cargo ship. That is the technical classification, and it is worth knowing what that actually means. General cargo ships are the workhorses of the maritime world. Not glamorous, not specialised, not particularly large by modern standards, but deeply necessary. They carry things, bulk goods, industrial materials, agricultural products, construction supplies. They go where the work is, which often means smaller ports, less developed coastlines, routes that the big container ships do not service. They are the vessels that fill in the gaps of global trade, moving material from one part of the world to another in a way that most people on land never think about and never see. The Alta was built in 1976 at a shipyard in Japan. That is worth sitting with for a moment. By the time it ended up on the rocks near Ballycotton in February 2020, the ship was 44 years old. For a vessel of its type, that is a long life. Ships are not like cars, where 40 years old means something sitting in a barn or a collector's garage. A working cargo ship that old has been continuously operated, repaired, patched, pushed through weather and loaded with cargo and run into ports around the world for decade after decade. The Alta was not vintage or cherished. It was simply old. Old in the way that something becomes when it has been used hard and maintained only as much as necessary to keep it functional. At 77 metres in length and approximately 1,900 gross tons, it was a mid-sized vessel for its era, not enormous but substantial. Gross tonnage, just to clarify, is a measure of the ship's total enclosed volume, not its weight. It is a technical figure, but what it tells you is that the Alta had significant internal capacity, holds large enough to carry meaningful quantities of cargo across long distances. The ship had a single hull, typical of its construction period. Modern ships are often double-hulled, which provides better protection against flooding if the outer hull is breached. The Alta's single-hull design, combined with its age, meant that by the time it was drifting in the Atlantic, its structural integrity was a serious concern. What the ship looked like, physically, is something you can piece together from the photographs taken when it was eventually found near the Irish coast. The hull was heavily corroded, deep rust stains running down the sides in long vertical streaks, the kind of oxidation that builds up over years when maintenance becomes irregular or insufficient. The paint, whatever colour it had originally been, was largely gone or faded beyond recognition. The superstructure, the raised section toward the stern where the bridge and crew quarters are located, was similarly weathered. This was not a ship that had been lovingly maintained. It was a ship that had been kept running, more or less, for as long as that was economically viable. The ownership history of the Alta is, to put it diplomatically, complicated. Over the course of its operational life, the ship passed through multiple owners, a pattern that is extremely common among aging general cargo vessels. Ships at this level of the market are bought and sold, transferred between holding companies, reflagged under different national registries, and operated under a series of arrangements that can make it genuinely difficult to determine who, at any given moment, is actually responsible for the vessel. This opacity is not accidental. It is in many ways a feature of how the lower end of the global shipping market operates. By the time of its final voyage, the Alta was registered under the Maltese flag. Flag registration is a significant concept in maritime law, and it is worth understanding briefly. When a ship is registered under a particular country's flag, that country, known as the flag state, takes on certain legal responsibilities for the vessel. It is supposed to ensure the ship meets international safety standards, that the crew is properly certified, that the vessel is seaworthy. Malta is what is known as an open registry, sometimes called a flag of convenience. It allows ships owned by companies from other countries to register under its flag, often because the regulatory requirements and fees are more favourable than registering in the owner's home country. Malta is one of the largest ship registries in the world by tonnage, and the vast majority of ships registered there are owned by companies with no actual connection to Malta. The last registered owner of the Alta was a company called Sudan Shipping Line Limited based in Tanzania. This is the company that, when the ship eventually broke down in the middle of the Atlantic and its crew was evacuated, had the legal responsibility to arrange for the vessel's salvage or disposal. How that responsibility was handled, or rather how it was not handled, is a central part of this story, but we will get there. For now, it is worth thinking about what the Alta's working life actually looked like. General cargo ships of this type typically operate on tramp shipping routes, meaning they do not follow fixed schedules between fixed ports the way large container ships do. Instead, they take whatever cargo is available, going wherever that cargo needs to go. One voyage might be carrying building materials from a Mediterranean port to a West African destination. The next might be agricultural goods from South America to the Caribbean. The routes are determined by the market, by whoever is willing to pay for the cargo space, and by the ship's ability to make the journey economically viable. This kind of shipping is, in many ways, the invisible backbone of global trade. The big container ships, the ones that carry millions of standardized containers between major hub ports, get most of the attention, and they handle an enormous volume of goods. But there is an entire parallel world of smaller vessels, older ships, less glamorous routes, carrying materials that do not fit neatly into containers, or that need to go to ports too small or too shallow for the giants. The Alta operated in this world for most of its life, moving things from one place to another quietly, without fanfare, in the way that most of the world's logistics actually works. By the time of its final voyage, the Alta was clearly a vessel in the later stages of its working life. Ships of this age and type are often operating on thin margins, the owners keeping them running as long as the revenue justifies the costs, and not necessarily investing heavily in maintenance or upgrades beyond what is strictly required to pass inspections. There is a point in the life of a working ship where the economics become difficult. Repair costs rise, fuel efficiency decreases, and the vessel becomes less competitive with newer tonnage. Some ships reach the end of their working lives and are sold for scrap, a process that, depending on where it happens, can itself be an environmental and human rights concern. Others continue operating until something forces the issue. For the Alta, what forced the issue was an engine failure in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but the conditions that made that engine failure so consequential, the age of the vessel, the opacity of its ownership structure, the thin margins of the shipping company operating it, those were not the result of a single bad decision. They were the accumulated result of how this particular corner of the maritime world tends to work. It is also worth noting, before moving on, that the Alta's crew had nothing to do with any of this. The 14 people who were aboard when the engine failed were simply doing their jobs on a ship that happened to be old, happened to be operated by a company with limited resources, and happened to break down very far from anywhere. The crew had no control over the vessel's ownership structure or its maintenance history. They were workers, on a ship doing what seafarers do, crossing oceans, carrying cargo, navigating the practical realities of working in one of the world's most demanding industries. The crew of the Alta, when the ship was on its final voyage, was made up primarily of Indian and Ukrainian nationals, a mix that is entirely typical of vessels operating in this sector of the market. The global shipping industry is heavily reliant on seafarers from a relatively small number of countries, particularly the Philippines, India, Indonesia, Ukraine and Russia, because labour costs in those countries make it economically viable for shipping companies to crew vessels at rates that would be impossible with workers from wealthier nations. It is a system that works, in the sense that it keeps goods moving around the world, but it is also a system with significant vulnerabilities, particularly when things go wrong. When the Alta's engine failed, those 14 crew members were in a genuinely precarious situation, mid-Atlantic on an aging vessel with no propulsion in one of the world's most demanding ocean environments. The fact that they were rescued safely is the most important part of their story. But the fact that the ship was simply left behind, that the company responsible for it made no meaningful effort to recover or salvage it, that is the part of the story that keeps echoing forward. There is something almost strange about the physical image of the Alta in those final weeks before it was found. A 77-metre ship sitting in the open Atlantic, empty, the cargo still in the hold, the crew's belongings still in the cabins, the bridge instrument still in place, the ship continuing to exist, continuing to float, continuing to drift, as if waiting for something, as if the ocean had not yet decided what to do with it. The North Atlantic is not a gentle environment. It is one of the most demanding stretches of ocean in the world, particularly in autumn and winter. The Alta drifted through it for 14 to 15 months, from October 2018 to February 2020. It survived storms that would test a fully crewed and powered vessel. It moved northeast, pushed by currents and wind, covering a distance that, by any reasonable expectation, should have ended with the ship on the bottom of the ocean or broken apart on some coastline long before it reached Ireland. How it survived that crossing, and what the physics of its drift actually looked like, is something worth understanding in detail. The ocean is not random. It has structure, currents and gyres and wind patterns that move predictable amounts of water in predictable directions over predictable timescales. A dead ship in the North Atlantic is not simply floating at the mercy of chaos. It is subject to forces that, while powerful and sometimes violent, have a logic to them. And it turns out that the Alta, heavy with its cargo of crushed stone low in the water, with its particular hull shape, was in some ways better suited to surviving that drift than a lighter or more lightly loaded vessel might have been. But before we get to the physics of the drift, and to the extraordinary path the Alta actually travelled across the Atlantic, we need to go back to where the story really begins, to September 2018 and a departure from the island of Crete, and a cargo of aggregate stone loaded into the hold of an ageing ship, and 14 crew members setting out across the ocean toward Haiti, with no reason at all to think that this voyage would be any different from any other. So let us go back to September 2018. The Alta is in Crete, in the southern Aegean, and it is being loaded for a voyage. The cargo is aggregate, crushed stone, gravel, the kind of raw material used in construction. Not glamorous, not valuable in any particular sense. Just heavy, inert material that someone in Haiti needed, and that the Alta was contracted to carry across the Atlantic. Aggregate is one of those cargoes that you almost never think about unless you're in the construction industry, and yet it moves around the world in enormous quantities. Roads, foundations, concrete, all of it requires aggregate. Haiti, which has been rebuilding infrastructure in various ways since the catastrophic 2010 earthquake, has an ongoing demand for construction materials. So the cargo makes sense, the voyage makes sense, everything at this point makes sense. The ship was loaded at Heraklion, the main port of Crete, or possibly at one of the island's smaller commercial terminals. The specific port of loading is not always clearly documented in the accounts that have been made public. What is clear is that by sometime in September 2018, the Alta was loaded, crewed, and ready to depart. 14 crew members aboard. The voyage ahead of them was long. Crossing the Atlantic from the eastern Mediterranean to the Caribbean is not a short trip. You're talking about thousands of miles, multiple weeks at sea, passing through the Strait of Gibraltar, out into the open Atlantic, and then southwest toward the Caribbean basin. For a vessel moving at typical cargo ship speeds, somewhere between 8 and 12 knots, depending on conditions and engine performance. A voyage like this could take 3 to 4 weeks or more. There is nothing in the available record to suggest the crew had any particular concern about the voyage before they departed. The Alta had made long voyages before. It was an old ship, but old ships cross oceans all the time. The crew were experienced seafarers. The cargo was straightforward. The route was well established. Whatever maintenance issues the ship may have had, whatever the state of its aging engine, the people aboard that vessel in September 2018 had no particular reason to believe that this voyage would be the one that went wrong. That is almost always how it is with these things. The catastrophic event is rarely preceded by a clear warning that anyone takes seriously enough to act on. It just begins as another ordinary voyage on another ordinary ship. The Alta made its way out of the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic without apparent incident. It passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow channel between Spain and Morocco where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, where the water changes character almost immediately, where the swells get longer and the horizon opens up, then out into the open ocean. The North Atlantic in September and October is not yet at its winter worst, but it is not calm either. Autumn storms begin building in those months, and the sea state can change quickly. For a heavily loaded cargo ship, though, the early part of the Atlantic crossing is usually manageable. The Alta would have been riding low in the water with its cargo of aggregate, which in some ways actually helps. A heavy, low ship tends to be more stable than a light one, less prone to rolling violently in beam seas. At some point during the Atlantic crossing, the exact location is approximate, and the exact date is not always consistently reported, but it appears to have been sometime in October 2018. The Alta's engine failed. The specific nature of the failure is not something that has been publicly documented in great detail. Engine failures on aging vessels can have many causes: a mechanical breakdown of a major component, fuel system problems, cooling system failure, any number of things that can go wrong in a decades-old marine diesel engine that has been running for years on a maintenance budget that was probably not generous. What matters for the story is the result. The ship lost propulsion in the middle of the Atlantic, roughly 1,380 miles southeast of Bermuda, according to the United States Coast Guard's later reporting. That is a long way from anywhere. To put it in some kind of perspective, 1,380 miles southeast of Bermuda puts you in open ocean, well south of the main North Atlantic shipping lanes, in water that is very deep and very far from any coastline. The crew would have known immediately that they were in a serious situation. A ship without propulsion in open ocean is not necessarily in immediate danger of sinking, but it is in a precarious position. It cannot maneuver. It cannot maintain a course. It is entirely at the mercy of wind and current, and if the weather turns bad, which in the North Atlantic in autumn is not unlikely, the situation can deteriorate quickly. The crew did what they were supposed to do. They issued a distress call. The international maritime distress frequencies are monitored continuously, and a distress call from a vessel in the mid-Atlantic will be picked up. The United States Coast Guard, which has responsibility for search and rescue operations across a vast area of the western and central Atlantic, received the call and responded. A C-130 aircraft, the Coast Guard's long-range maritime patrol and rescue aircraft, was dispatched to locate the vessel. This C-130 Hercules is a 4-engine turboprop that can fly for many hours and cover enormous distances, which makes it well suited for exactly this kind of search. It found the Alta. The ship was still afloat, still drifting, with all 14 crew members aboard. The rescue operation that followed was coordinated by the Coast Guard. The details of exactly how the crew was evacuated, whether by helicopter, by a rescue vessel, or by some combination, are not always clearly specified in the public accounts. But what is clear is that all 14 crew members were safely removed from the Alta. This is the most important fact in the immediate story. Nobody died. 14 people who were in a genuinely dangerous situation in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean were successfully rescued and brought to safety. That is a significant operation, and the Coast Guard's ability to locate and evacuate the crew of a distressed vessel that far from shore is a reminder of how sophisticated maritime search and rescue has become. But then comes the part of the story that sets everything else in motion. Once the crew was off the Alta, the ship was left. Just left. Floating in the mid-Atlantic without an anchor deployed, without a crew, without any immediate plan for what would happen to it next. This is not as unusual as it might sound. When a vessel loses propulsion in open ocean and a rescue operation is underway, the priority is always the crew. The ship is secondary. You get the people off first and you deal with the vessel afterward. The assumption, in most cases, is that the owner will arrange for a salvage tug to come out, secure the vessel, and tow it to a port where repairs can be made or the ship can be assessed. That is the normal sequence of events. Rescue the crew, then recover the ship. What happened with the Alta is that the second part of that sequence never really happened. Sudan Shipping Line, the company listed as the vessel's owner or operator, apparently made no meaningful effort to arrange salvage. Whether this was because the company lacked the financial resources to pay for a salvage operation, which, for a vessel 1,380 miles from Bermuda, would have been expensive, or because the decision was made that the ship was not worth recovering, or because of some combination of organisational dysfunction and financial calculation, the result was the same. The Alta was left adrift. This is the moment where the story shifts. Up until this point, the Alta's situation is a maritime casualty. Unfortunate, but not especially unusual. Engine failures happen. Rescues happen. What makes the Alta's story different from thousands of other maritime incidents is what happens next, and what happens next is essentially nothing. No salvage tug comes. No owner steps forward with a plan. The ship just drifts. Days pass, then weeks, then months. Under maritime law, a vessel's owner has legal obligations in situations like this. The ship is still property. It is still registered. It is still flying a flag, in the Alta's case, the Maltese flag. Malta, as the flag state, has certain responsibilities under international maritime conventions, including the obligation to ensure that vessels flying its flag comply with safety standards and that situations like this are properly addressed. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS, and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, known as UNCLOS, both contain provisions that are relevant here. But maritime law is complex, enforcement across international waters is difficult, and the practical reality is that a company with limited assets, operating a vessel registered in a flag of convenience state, can sometimes simply fail to meet its obligations without facing immediate consequences. The phrase flag of convenience refers to the practice of registering a ship in a country other than the country of the ship's owners, usually because the registry country offers lower fees, less stringent regulations, or more favourable tax treatment. Malta is a legitimate European Union member state with a serious maritime registry, not the most extreme example of a flag of convenience arrangement, but the broader system creates situations where the chain of accountability between a ship and its actual beneficial owners is not always easy to trace or enforce. Sudan Shipping Line, registered in Tanzania, operating a Maltese-flagged vessel with a crew of primarily Indian and Ukrainian nationals, The Alta was a vessel assembled from multiple different national and legal jurisdictions, and when something went wrong, that complexity made accountability difficult. The 14 crew members, once rescued, were presumably repatriated to their home countries. Their employment on the Alta was over. Whatever wages were owed to them, whatever arrangements were made for their travel home, the crew's direct involvement with the Alta ended at the moment they stepped off the ship. They had been rescued from a difficult situation, and that was the end of their story with this particular vessel. What happened to the ship after that was no longer their concern, and they had no control over it in any case. The Alta was now simply an object, a large, heavy, aging object, sitting in the mid-Atlantic with no one to care for it. It is worth pausing for a moment to think about what the Alta looked like at this point. October 2018. Empty. Sitting low in the water with its cargo of crushed stone. No lights on, no engine running, no anchor holding it in place. The bridge dark and quiet. The crew quarters empty, with whatever personal belongings the crew had left behind still sitting where they had been left. Clothes perhaps, personal items, the small things that people keep with them on long voyages, the galley where the crew had eaten their meals, now still. The navigation instruments on the bridge, still registering data about a ship that had no one to read it. The AIS signal, the automatic identification system that ships use to broadcast their position and identity to other vessels, and to shore-based monitoring stations, would have still been transmitting for some time, running off whatever power remained in the ship's systems. But as the batteries drained and the systems shut down one by one, the Alta would have gone dark on the tracking systems that maritime authorities use to monitor vessel movements. A ship that stops transmitting AIS is not automatically cause for alarm. There are legitimate reasons a vessel might not be broadcasting. But a ship that disappears from tracking and does not respond to radio calls is a different matter. The Alta became, in the language of maritime monitoring, a navigational hazard. A large, dark, unlit object drifting in the Atlantic is a genuine danger to other vessels, particularly at night or in poor visibility. Maritime authorities were aware of the situation. The Coast Guard rescue operation had documented the ship's position and condition. But the question of what to do about a vessel that had been legally abandoned in international waters, with an owner who was not responding, and a flag state that had not taken decisive action, was not a simple one to answer. And so the Alta drifted. The North Atlantic is not a static place. It has structure, a complex system of currents and gyres that move enormous volumes of water in patterns that are, in broad terms, predictable. The Gulf Stream, pushing warm water northeast from the Gulf of Mexico, up along the eastern coast of North America, is the dominant feature of the western North Atlantic. As it moves northeast and away from the American coast, it broadens and slows into the North Atlantic current, which continues pushing water in a generally northeastern direction toward Europe. Surface winds in the North Atlantic tend to blow from west to east across much of the basin, particularly in the mid-latitudes. A dead ship sitting in this environment is going to move. It is not going to stay where it was left. The question is where it will go, and how fast, and whether it will survive the journey. The Alta, as it turned out, was going to travel a very long way. But in October 2018, that journey was just beginning, and nobody, not the Coast Guard, not the Irish Navy, not any maritime authority, knew yet what the ship was going to do over the next 14 months. They knew where it was. They knew it was a hazard. And they knew that nobody was coming to get it. What they did not know was that the Alta was about to cross the Atlantic entirely on its own, driven by forces that had been moving water across that ocean long before the first ship ever sailed it. So let us go back to October 2018 and think carefully about what actually happened in those first days after the rescue, because the details matter, and they reveal something important about how a situation like this is allowed to develop. The United States Coast Guard had done its job. A C-130 aircraft had located the vessel. a rescue coordination effort had been mounted. All 14 crew members had been safely evacuated from the Alta and brought to safety. That is not a small thing. A mid-Atlantic engine failure on an aging cargo ship with no nearby vessel to assist is a genuinely dangerous situation, and the fact that everyone got off safely is worth acknowledging before moving on to everything else that went wrong. The crew, mostly Indian and Ukrainian nationals, working a difficult and unglamorous job on an aging ship for modest wages, were alive. They were going home. Whatever came next for the Alta, the human part of the story had a relatively clean ending. But the rescue operation itself does not tell you very much about what came after it, because the moment the last crew member stepped off that ship, a different set of questions came into play, questions that turned out to be much harder to answer. When a vessel is abandoned at sea, not in a distress situation but deliberately left by its owner, maritime law has a framework for dealing with it. The framework is not always effective, but it exists. Under the international conventions that govern maritime conduct, the registered owner of a vessel has an obligation to ensure that the ship does not become a hazard to navigation, and to arrange for salvage or proper disposal if the vessel can no longer operate under its own power. This is not an obscure legal technicality. It is a basic principle of responsible ship ownership, and it exists for obvious reasons. A large metal object drifting uncontrolled through busy shipping lanes is dangerous. It can sink. It can collide with other vessels. It can run aground and cause environmental damage. The law says, if your ship breaks down, you are responsible for dealing with it. The registered owner of the Alta was Sudan Shipping Line Limited, based in Tanzania. And what Sudan Shipping Line apparently did in the weeks and months after the rescue was essentially nothing. Or if they did anything, it did not result in any meaningful effort to recover or salvage the vessel. The company was not easy to reach. Maritime authorities attempting to make contact found the lines of communication frustratingly unclear. This is not unusual in the world of small end-of-life cargo shipping. Companies operating at the margins of the industry, running old ships on thin margins, registered in one country, flagged in another, crewed from a third, sometimes have very limited assets and very limited appetite for taking on the cost of a salvage operation. A proper salvage tow in the mid-Atlantic is extraordinarily expensive. You need a specialised tug, a long ocean passage, port fees, legal arrangements, and all of it costs money that a company in financial difficulty may simply not have. The flag state is Malta, and Malta, as the country whose flag the Alta flew, had obligations of its own. Under the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS, and under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, flag states are required to exercise effective jurisdiction and control over ships registered under their flag. That includes ensuring that those ships comply with international safety standards, and that, when something goes wrong, appropriate action is taken. Malta has a large and well-established ship registry, one of the largest in the world in fact, with thousands of vessels registered under its flag, and it is a legitimate registry with professional staff and real regulatory functions. But the practical challenge of enforcing obligations on a vessel owned by a company in Tanzania, drifting in the mid-Atlantic when the owner is unresponsive and the ship has no crew, is considerable. Malta could apply pressure. It could threaten to deregister the vessel. It could work through diplomatic channels. But making something actually happen is a different matter from having the legal authority to require it. Lloyd's of London, the insurance market that underwrites a large proportion of the world's commercial shipping, was presumably involved in some capacity. Marine insurance is a legal requirement for commercial vessels in most jurisdictions, and the Alta would have needed to carry some level of coverage to operate. But the details of the Alta's insurance arrangements are not publicly documented in any detailed way, and it is not clear what coverage was in place, whether claims were made or whether insurers were actively involved in discussions about the vessel's fate. What is clear is that no salvage operation materialised. No tug was dispatched to the mid-Atlantic to collect the drifting ship. No plan was announced. The Alta sat in the ocean, and the weeks passed, and nothing happened. there is something almost administrative about the way this situation developed, or rather failed to develop. You might expect that a large abandoned vessel in the middle of the Atlantic would prompt urgent action, some kind of coordinated international response. And in a way it did. There were notifications, there were communications between maritime authorities, there were entries in logbooks and databases marking the Alta as a known hazard. But urgent action requires someone willing to pay for it, and in this case that person did not exist. The owner was not stepping forward. The flag state was not in a position to fund a salvage operation itself. The United States Coast Guard had discharged its immediate duty by rescuing the crew. No other authority had clear jurisdiction or clear motivation to spend the considerable sum required to deal with a ship that, legally speaking, was still someone else's problem. This is one of the genuinely strange things about maritime law as it applies to situations like this. The ocean is vast, and the jurisdictional framework that governs it is a patchwork of international conventions, bilateral agreements, flag state obligations, and coastal state rights that can produce real gaps in accountability. A ship in international waters, more than 12 nautical miles from any coast, is primarily the responsibility of its flag state. Coastal states have rights in their exclusive economic zones, which extend to 200 nautical miles. But those rights relate mainly to resource exploitation and environmental protection, not to the general policing of navigation hazards. A ship drifting in the middle of the Atlantic, far from any coast, exists in a space where the practical ability to intervene is limited, and the legal obligation to do so falls on parties who may lack the means or the will to act. So the Alta drifted, and as it drifted it became something else. Not just a legal problem or a navigation hazard, but a kind of object lesson in what happens when the systems that are supposed to govern the shipping industry fail to function as intended. The ship itself did not know any of this, of course. It was just a hull full of gravel, sitting in the water, going where the currents took it. But the circumstances that had put it there, the aging vessel, the undercapitalized owner, the flag of convenience registration, the crew of workers from countries far from the ship's registry and far from its destination, were not accidental. They were the product of a particular way of organising global shipping that prioritises low costs and operational flexibility over clear lines of accountability. The 14 crew members, meanwhile, were presumably making their way home. The process of repatriating a crew after a rescue at sea involves coordination between the Coast Guard, the ship's management company, and the seafarers' home countries. Seafarers' welfare organisations, groups like the International Transport Workers Federation or the Mission to Seafarers, sometimes get involved in cases like this, helping crew members navigate the administrative process of getting home, recovering unpaid wages, and dealing with the aftermath of a difficult voyage. Whether any of these organisations were involved in the Alta case is not clearly documented. What seems likely is that the crew members, once safely ashore, found themselves in the complicated position of having lost their employment, being owed wages that may or may not have been paid, and having limited recourse against an owner who was effectively unreachable. This is a pattern that recurs throughout the shipping industry. It is common enough that there is a specific term for it: seafarer abandonment. The ITF maintains a database of abandonment cases, and the numbers are sobering, but that is a larger story, and we will come back to it later. For now, the crew is gone, and the ship is alone. And there is one physical detail worth dwelling on for a moment, because it turns out to be quietly significant. The Alta was carrying a cargo of aggregate, crushed stone, gravel, the kind of material used in construction. Aggregate is heavy. A hold full of crushed stone sits low in the water, which gives a vessel a lower centre of gravity and makes it more stable in rough seas. This is not nothing. A ship with an empty hold sits higher in the water, catches more wind, and rolls more dramatically in swells. A ship loaded with dense, heavy cargo is harder to capsize. Nobody planned for this to matter. The aggregate was supposed to be delivered to Haiti, not to serve as ballast for a 15-month solo crossing of the Atlantic. But the physics do not care about intentions. The stone that was meant to build something in the Caribbean would, in a quiet and entirely unplanned way, help keep the Alta upright through some of the worst weather the North Atlantic can produce. The AIS signal, as mentioned, would have faded as the ship's electrical systems drained down. Without crew to run the generators, without fuel being consumed to produce power, the Alta's ability to broadcast its position would have diminished and eventually stopped. This made tracking it significantly harder. Satellite monitoring systems can sometimes detect large metal objects even without AIS, and there were occasional reports of the Alta being sighted or detected in the months that followed. But the ship's movements during its long drift are not documented in precise detail. We know where it started roughly and we know where it ended up. The path in between is reconstructed from current patterns, wind data, and the occasional sighting report. A kind of dead reckoning applied after the fact, working backward from where the ship arrived to understand how it must have travelled. What is clear is that by late 2018 and into 2019 the Alta was moving. The North Atlantic was doing what it always does, pushing water northeast, driving surface winds from west to east, cycling weather systems through the basin in the endless progression that Atlantic sailors have navigated for centuries. The Alta had no crew to read those conditions, no engine to fight them or take advantage of them, no rudder to steer by. It was simply in the water, and the water was moving, and so the ship moved with it. Slowly, over weeks and then months, the Alta worked its way northeast across one of the world's largest bodies of water, following a path that no navigator had planned and no one was watching in real time. Maritime authorities had logged it as a hazard. The flag state had been notified. The owner had not responded in any meaningful way. And the ship kept moving. It would be 14 months before anyone boarded the Alta again. 14 months of open ocean, Atlantic storms, and the kind of indifferent persistence that large, heavy objects sometimes display when the sea has not yet decided to take them. The ship that had been left for dead in the mid-Atlantic was quietly and without any assistance making its way toward Europe. And what it would find there, and what would be found aboard it, is where this story takes its next turn. To understand what the Alta actually did during those 14 months, it helps to think about the North Atlantic not as an empty space, but as a system. A slow, enormous, constantly moving system that has been running in more or less the same pattern for thousands of years. The ocean is not still water that ships push through. It is water that is itself in motion, driven by temperature differences, salinity gradients, the rotation of the Earth, and the persistent pressure of prevailing winds. And in the North Atlantic, that motion follows a recognisable shape. The dominant feature is the North Atlantic Gyre, a large, roughly circular current system that moves clockwise when viewed from above. Warm water flows north along the eastern coast of North America as the Gulf Stream, then curves northeast across the open ocean as the North Atlantic Current, eventually reaching the waters around Iceland and the British Isles, before cooling, sinking and returning south along the eastern side of the Atlantic. It is a cycle that has been running for a very long time, and it is powerful enough to move enormous quantities of water across thousands of miles. The Gulf Stream, at its strongest, can carry more water than all the world's rivers combined. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a measurement. The Alta, when it was abandoned in October 2018, was sitting roughly 1,380 miles southeast of Bermuda. That position placed it in a part of the Atlantic where several forces would have been acting on the hull simultaneously. The prevailing surface winds in that region during autumn tend to blow from the west and southwest, which pushes surface water, and anything floating in it, toward the east and northeast. The North Atlantic Current runs in roughly the same direction. A dead ship with no engine and no rudder is essentially a very large piece of floating debris, and floating debris in the North Atlantic tends to move northeast. This is not a coincidence or a mystery, it is just physics. What makes the Alta's drift remarkable is not the direction, which was broadly predictable, but the distance and the duration. From its abandonment point southeast of Bermuda to its eventual appearance off the coast of Ireland is roughly 3,000 miles, possibly more depending on the exact path it followed. And it covered that distance over approximately 14 to 15 months, which works out to an average speed of something like 6 or 7 miles per day. That is very slow by any nautical standard, a brisk walking pace more or less. But it is consistent with what we know about how surface currents and wind-driven drift actually move objects through the North Atlantic. Oceanographers who study marine debris, everything from lost cargo containers to plastic pollution, have documented drift rates in this range many times. The Alta was not doing anything physically impossible. It was just doing it at a scale that is hard to quite believe. The ship would have had no way to maintain a straight course. Without a rudder under active control, a vessel's heading is determined by the balance of forces acting on its hull and any superstructure above the waterline. Wind pushes on the sides of the ship and the bridge structure above the deck. Current pushes on the submerged hull. These forces are rarely perfectly aligned, which means a drifting ship tends to yaw, to rotate slowly around its vertical axis as it moves. It does not travel in a straight line, it wanders, in the way that a leaf wanders across the surface of a pond when there's a light breeze. The overall direction of travel is determined by the dominant forces, but the moment-to-moment heading can vary considerably. This matters because it means the Alta was not threading a precise course through the Atlantic. It was moving in a general direction while oscillating unpredictably around that direction. And the North Atlantic, particularly in autumn and winter, is not a calm or forgiving environment. The weather systems that cross the basin during those months can generate sustained winds of 40 or 50 knots and wave heights of 6, 8, 10 meters or more. A vessel without engine power cannot maneuver in those conditions. It cannot turn into the waves to reduce the rolling motion. It cannot run with the sea at a controlled angle to manage its speed. It is simply at the mercy of whatever the ocean decides to do on a given day. And the ocean, during a North Atlantic winter, tends to be assertive. The Alta survived this. That is the part that maritime professionals who have looked at this case tend to find quietly surprising. Not because ships cannot survive storms. They do all the time, with experienced crews managing the vessel through the conditions. But an unmanned, unpowered ship has none of those active defences. It cannot be steered. It cannot be slowed or accelerated. If a wave hits it at a bad angle, there is no one to correct the resulting motion. The fact that the Alta did not capsize, did not take on enough water to sink, and did not simply break apart in heavy weather over 14 months of North Atlantic winter and spring and autumn is genuinely notable. Part of the explanation, as mentioned earlier, is the aggregate cargo. Crushed stone is dense, considerably denser than water, and a hold full of it sits very low in the water. A low centre of gravity makes a ship more resistant to rolling over. It is the same principle that makes a wide, low-slung car more stable in a corner than a tall, narrow one. The Alta, loaded with gravel destined for Haiti, was inadvertently well ballasted for an extended solo drift. The cargo that had made the voyage commercially viable, and that would never reach its destination, was also, in a quiet and entirely unplanned way, keeping the ship alive. There is also the question of the hull itself. The Alta was old, built in 1976, which made it 42 years old at the time of its abandonment. Older vessels are sometimes assumed to be more fragile, more prone to failure. And there is truth to that, in the sense that corrosion and wear accumulate over decades, and structural integrity can be compromised if maintenance has been inadequate. But the Alta's hull, whatever its condition, was made of steel. Steel, even aged and rusted steel, is not easily defeated by water alone. A hull that is not actively holed, not struck by another vessel, not run onto rocks, not catastrophically compromised by corrosion, will tend to float. It may not float comfortably. It may flex and creak and take on small amounts of water in places where seals have failed. But it will float. The sea has to work to sink a steel ship, and the Alta, drifting through the Atlantic, was giving the sea relatively little to work with. No propeller turning, No exhaust system cycling, no moving parts to fail. Just a hull and a hold full of stone moving slowly northeast. Satellite tracking of the Alta during its drift is a complicated subject. Modern cargo ships are required to carry AIS transponders, automatic identification system devices that broadcast the vessel's identity, position, heading, and speed at regular intervals. These signals are received by other ships and by shore-based stations, and they are also picked up by satellite-based receivers that provide global coverage. Under normal circumstances, a ship like the Alta would have been continuously trackable. But the AIS transponder requires electrical power to operate, and as the Alta's generators ran down without crew to maintain them, and without fuel being actively managed, the ship's electrical systems would have degraded. At some point, probably within the first weeks or months of the abandonment, the AIS signal would have gone dark. After that, tracking the Alta becomes much harder. There are satellite systems that can detect large metal objects even without active transponders, using radar or optical imaging, but these are not continuously monitoring every square mile of the Atlantic. There were occasional reports, from vessels that passed near enough to spot the Alta visually, or from satellite passes that caught its position, but the documentation is not continuous. Maritime authorities in several countries were aware that the Alta was adrift and logged it as a navigational hazard, which is the formal maritime designation for an unlit, uncrewed vessel in open water. A navigational hazard is something that other ships need to be warned about, something that could cause a collision if encountered unexpectedly at night or in poor visibility. The Alta, sitting dark and silent in the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic, was exactly that kind of hazard. The North Atlantic is one of the world's busiest ocean regions. The shipping lanes between North America and Europe carry an enormous volume of commercial traffic. Container ships, bulk carriers, tankers, ro-ro vessels, passenger ships. These lanes are not marked on the water, of course, but they are well-established routes that vessels follow based on weather routing, port schedules, and the conventions of international maritime traffic. The Alta, drifting on its uncontrolled path, would have crossed these lanes at some point during its 14-month journey. The fact that it did not collide with another vessel during that crossing is partly a matter of the sheer size of the ocean. The Atlantic is vast, and even busy shipping lanes have a lot of empty water between vessels, and partly perhaps a matter of luck. A collision between a large, dark, unlit vessel and a commercial ship travelling at 15 or 20 knots would have been a serious event for both. It did not happen. The Alta drifted through, or around, or between the lanes, and kept moving northeast. By the time 2019 was well underway, the Alta had been at sea alone for the better part of a year. The seasons had turned. The North Atlantic had gone through a full winter and into spring and summer. The ship had moved steadily, if erratically, across the basin. The aggregate in the hold was still there. Stone does not spoil, does not shift dramatically in a sealed hold, does not change its character with the weather. The hull was aging in the water, accumulating marine growth on its underwater surfaces, developing whatever additional corrosion comes from extended immersion without maintenance. But it was still floating, still moving. There is something almost meditative about imagining it, if you allow yourself to. A ship moving through the open Atlantic with no one aboard. No sounds except the creak of the hull in the swells, the occasional groan of metal under stress, the constant noise of water against the sides, the deck wet from spray, then drying in the sun, then wet again. The bridge empty, the wheel unmanned, the instruments dark. Seabirds landing on the superstructure, resting, leaving. The sun rising and setting over an empty ocean, day after day, with no one on board to watch it. There is something genuinely strange about that image. Not supernatural, not frightening exactly, but strange in the way that large, indifferent processes often are when you stop to look at them directly. Sometime in late 2019 or early 2020, The Alta was close enough to European waters that its presence was becoming a more immediate concern for maritime authorities. The Irish Coast Guard and the Irish Naval Service were among the organisations tracking its approximate position. The ship was moving toward the eastern edge of the Atlantic, toward the waters around the British Isles and Ireland, the Irish Exclusive Economic Zone, the maritime area in which Ireland has jurisdiction over resources and certain responsibilities, extends 200 nautical miles from the coast. Beyond that, in international waters, the situation is legally more complex. But the Alta was getting closer. The question of what to do about it was becoming less theoretical and more pressing. The ship had crossed an ocean. It had survived storms and seasons and the long, dark months of a North Atlantic winter without anyone aboard to tend to it. It had become, in a quiet way, something of a known quantity among the people whose job it is to track vessels at sea, a problem that had been noted, logged, discussed, and not yet resolved. And now it was approaching the end of its long, unplanned journey, though no one aboard, because there was no one aboard, could have known that. The currents and the winds that had carried it this far were still doing their work, still pushing the hull northeast, still indifferent to the legal complications and the unanswered questions and the absent owner. The Alta was almost there, and on a February morning in 2020 a vessel of the Irish Naval Service would come over the horizon and find it waiting. February 14th, 2020. Valentine's Day, as it happens, though that detail feels almost too strange to mention, and yet somehow impossible not to. The LE Samuel Beckett was on routine patrol in the North Atlantic, operating in the waters west of Ireland. The Samuel Beckett is a patrol vessel of the Irish Naval Service, 90 metres long, commissioned in 2014, named after the playwright, which gives it a certain literary weight if you're in the mood to notice such things. It was doing what naval patrol vessels do, moving through its assigned area, monitoring traffic, watching the sea. Approximately 700 nautical miles west of the Irish coast, the crew spotted something on radar and then, as they closed the distance, visually, a large vessel, dark, no light showing, no AIS signal broadcasting its identity or position. Just a hull sitting in the water, neither moving with purpose nor at anchor. 700 miles is a long way from shore. That is not a vessel that has just drifted out of a harbour or broken down near a coast. That is a ship in the deep open Atlantic, in water that is thousands of metres deep beneath it, with nothing around it except ocean in every direction. The crew of the Samuel Beckett would have known immediately that something was wrong. A vessel that size, that far out, showing no lights and no signal, does not have an innocent explanation. They hailed the ship on radio. Standard procedure. No response. They tried again on different frequencies. Still nothing. They circled the vessel, getting a visual assessment from the water. The hull was heavily rusted, the kind of rust that does not develop in weeks or months but in years of exposure and neglect. The paint was gone in large sections, leaving bare, corroded metal. There was no movement on deck, no faces at the rail, no lights in the portholes, no smoke from any exhaust. The ship was dead in the water, and as far as anyone could tell from the outside, it was empty. The decision was made to board her. Boarding an unknown vessel in the open Atlantic is not a casual operation. The sea conditions in that part of the ocean in February are not gentle. The North Atlantic in winter produces swells that can run to several metres, and even on a relatively calm day, the movement of the water is constant and significant. A small inflatable craft, a rigid inflatable boat, the kind used for exactly this sort of operation, was launched from the Samuel Beckett. A boarding party of Irish naval personnel crossed the water between the two ships, which is a short distance in terms of metres, but a meaningful distance when you're in a small boat in Atlantic swells, with a rusted hull looming above you. Getting onto the Alta would have required climbing. There are standard ways to board a vessel that is not cooperating with your arrival. Rope ladders, grappling lines, climbing up the anchor chain housing or whatever fixed structure is accessible at the waterline. The Alta was not at anchor, so it was moving with the swells, which means the hull was rising and falling relative to the boarding party's inflatable. Timing a climb onto a moving hull in open water is exactly as awkward as it sounds. The naval personnel managed it, and then they were on the deck of the MV Alta. What they found was a ship that had been empty for roughly 16 months. The deck was wet and corroded, covered in the kind of grime and biological growth that accumulates when no one is cleaning or maintaining anything. Some areas of the deck plating were in poor condition, soft spots where corrosion had eaten through, surfaces that required careful footing. The superstructure, which is the raised section of a cargo ship that houses the bridge, the crew quarters, the engine room access and so on, was intact but visibly deteriorated. Doors were either open or had been left in whatever position the departing crew had left them in October 2018. Inside, the picture was what you might expect from a ship that had been hastily evacuated and then left alone for over a year. Personal belongings were still present, the kind of things that people leave behind when they are being rescued from a failing vessel and told to take only what they need. Clothing, some personal items, the ordinary clutter of a working crew's living quarters, now damp and deteriorating, sitting in the same positions they had been in when the ship was abandoned. There was food aboard as well, some supplies that had been left in the galley in various states of decay after 16 months without refrigeration or any climate control. The ship's stores had not been fully removed when the crew left. The bridge was empty, of course. The navigation instruments were dark and non-functional. The wheel was unmanned. Whatever charts or documents had been on the bridge were still there, or had shifted with the movement of the ship over the months. Paper documents left in a ship that has been rolling through Atlantic storms for over a year do not stay neatly organised. The engine room was flooded in some areas, and the engineering spaces showed the condition you would expect of machinery that had been non-functional and unmaintained for well over a year in a saltwater environment. The main engine was dead. In the cargo holds, the aggregate was still there, crushed stone, loaded in Crete in 2018, originally destined for Haiti. Tons of it, sitting in the dark holds of a ship that had travelled thousands of miles without ever delivering it. Stone is stable cargo. It does not rot, does not shift dramatically, does not produce gases or create fire risk. The weight of it, distributed in the holds, had kept the Alta sitting reasonably low and steady in the water throughout its drift. That stability, as it turns out, may have been one of the reasons the ship survived as long as it did without capsizing. The boarding party also found that the ship was taking on water in some areas. Not catastrophically, the Alta was still floating obviously, but there were sections of the hull where water had found its way in through corroded seams or compromised plating. A ship that is not being actively pumped out will accumulate water in its lower spaces over time, and the Alta had not been pumped out in 16 months. The bilges would have been wet, some compartments partially flooded. The structural integrity of the hull was compromised in ways that were not immediately catastrophic, but were clearly progressing. The ship was not in imminent danger of sinking at the moment the boarding party was on it, but it was not a healthy vessel either. It was a vessel that had been slowly losing its battle with the sea for over a year. There is something about walking through a space that has been human and then abandoned that tends to affect people in a particular way. Sailors especially tend to feel it, because ships are intensely inhabited spaces. The crew of a working vessel lives aboard, eats aboard, sleeps aboard, spends months at a time in close quarters with the same small group of people. A ship has a particular kind of presence when it is working and crewed. When it is empty, that presence becomes something else. The Irish naval personnel who boarded the Alta were professionals doing a job, and their accounts of the boarding are practical and factual rather than atmospheric. But the scene they walked into, the personal belongings, the abandoned food, the dark and silent bridge, has a quality to it that is hard to ignore even when you're trying to be matter-of-fact about it. The boarding party assessed what they could. They confirmed there was no crew aboard, which had been the working assumption but needed to be verified. They assessed the structural condition of the ship as best they could given the circumstances. They noted the cargo. They checked for any immediate environmental hazards. Fuel oil in the tanks, for instance, is a concern with any vessel in distress, because a hull breach that releases fuel oil creates an environmental incident on top of everything else. The Alta was carrying residual fuel in its bunker tanks, not a full load, but enough to be a concern. A ship that has been running on its own fuel for however long its engine was operational before the breakdown, and then sitting for 16 months without anyone monitoring its tank conditions, is a ship whose fuel situation is uncertain. The tanks themselves, if corroded or compromised, could leak. That was something that would need to be dealt with, but it was not an immediate emergency in the open ocean. The more pressing question was what to do with the ship itself. The Samuel Beckett was not equipped to tow a 1,900-ton cargo vessel 700 miles to the nearest port. That is not what patrol vessels do. What the Samuel Beckett could do was report the find, document the condition of the Alta, and set in motion the chain of notifications and decisions that would determine what happened next. The Irish Naval Service contacted the relevant authorities, the Maritime Casualty Investigation Board, which handles incidents involving vessels in Irish waters and the surrounding area, and the Flag State Authority, which in the Alta's case was Malta. Malta, as the country under whose flag the Alta was registered, had certain obligations under international maritime law. Those obligations, and the question of who was actually going to act on them, were about to become complicated very quickly. The Alta sat in the water, 700 miles from the Irish coast, while the people who had just boarded it began making phone calls and filing reports. The ship had been a navigational hazard for over a year. It had been tracked, noted, and not dealt with. Now it was someone's formal problem, with naval personnel physically present on its deck, and the question of what to do next could not be deferred any further. The sea around them was the February North Atlantic, grey, cold, moving with the kind of persistent swell that does not stop for administrative deliberations or legal questions about jurisdiction. The Alta sat in that sea, rusted and listing slightly, holding its cargo of stone, and waited in the way that objects wait, which is to say without any awareness of waiting at all. The people aboard the Samuel Beckett, and the people they were calling on shore, were the ones doing the actual waiting for answers about ownership, about responsibility, about what the law said, and what was practically possible, and what was going to happen to this ship that had crossed an ocean with no one on board to steer it. Those answers, as it turned out, were not going to be simple or quick in coming, and the Atlantic, indifferent as always to the complications of human law and logistics, was not going to hold its weather while anyone figured them out. So the calls went out, the Maritime Casualty Investigation Board was notified, Malta was contacted, and the first thing that became clear, fairly quickly, was that the simple question of who owned the Alta did not have a simple answer. The ship was registered under the Maltese flag. That registration made Malta the flag state, the country legally responsible for ensuring the vessel met international safety and operational standards. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, commonly known as UNCLOS, and under the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS, flag states carry real obligations. They are supposed to ensure that vessels flying their flag are properly maintained, properly crewed, properly insured. When something goes wrong with a flagged vessel, when it becomes a hazard, when it is abandoned, the flag state has a role to play in the response, in theory. In practice, the relationship between a flag state and the vessels registered under its flag is often much thinner than the legal framework implies. Malta is what is sometimes called a flag of convenience registry, one of a group of countries, including Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands, that allow foreign-owned ships to register under their flag for a fee. The arrangement is legal and widespread. It gives ship owners access to certain regulatory environments, lower costs in some cases, and administrative convenience. It gives the flag state revenue. What it does not always give is a close, attentive relationship between the registry authority and the actual condition of the ships on its books. Malta has a large shipping registry. It registers thousands of vessels. It cannot realistically monitor all of them with any depth. When the Irish Naval Service contacted Malta about the Alta, they were contacting an administrative body about a ship that had been adrift for 16 months, owned by a company that had shown no meaningful interest in recovering it, and now sitting 700 miles off the Irish coast with no crew and a compromised hull. Malta had obligations. Whether those obligations were going to translate into action was a different question. The registered owner of the Alta was Sudan Shipping Line Limited, based in Tanzania. And here is where the trail becomes genuinely difficult to follow. Sudan Shipping Line, as an entity, appears to have had minimal operational presence. The company does not appear in any significant maritime industry records as an active, functioning shipping operation. It had no obvious fleet of vessels, no established routes, no publicly traceable management structure. It had a name, a registration, and a ship. And after the ship broke down in the middle of the Atlantic in October 2018, it appears to have had essentially no further involvement with that ship at all. No salvage was arranged. No insurance claim appears to have been publicly pursued. No representative of the company made contact with the authorities who were attempting to deal with the Alta's situation. When the Irish authorities tried to reach Sudan Shipping Line in February 2020, they found more or less nothing to reach. The company was either unable or unwilling to respond in any meaningful way. Whether it still existed as a functioning entity at all was unclear. This is not, unfortunately, an unusual situation in the world of shipping. The beneficial ownership of vessels, meaning who actually controls and profits from a ship, as opposed to who is listed as the registered owner on paper, is notoriously opaque. A ship can be registered to one company, managed by another, chartered by a third, and the actual financial beneficiary of its operation can be a fourth entity, or a private individual, or a holding structure spread across multiple jurisdictions. When a vessel fails, when it becomes a liability rather than an asset, the people who actually controlled it have strong incentives to make themselves difficult to find. The paper trail leads to an address in Tanzania, and the address in Tanzania leads nowhere useful, and the ship sits in the North Atlantic while lawyers and maritime officials try to figure out what to do next. This is the legal grey zone that the Alta had been sitting in since October 2018, and it was still very much a grey zone in February 2020. The ship had not been formally declared a wreck. It had not been formally abandoned under the legal definitions that would trigger certain response mechanisms. It was a vessel adrift, a navigational hazard, yes, but one that existed in a complicated space between the categories that international maritime law uses to determine who is responsible and what must be done. The options available to the Irish authorities were, broadly speaking, three. They could arrange to have the ship towed to port. They could, under certain conditions and with certain approvals, arrange to have it sunk. Or they could leave it and continue monitoring it as a hazard. Each option had serious complications. Towing a dead 1,900-ton cargo vessel 700 nautical miles to an Irish port sounds straightforward if you have not thought much about ocean towing. In practice, it is an expensive, technically demanding and genuinely dangerous operation. You need a vessel capable of the tow, not a naval patrol boat, but a purpose-built ocean-going tug with sufficient power and the right equipment. You need tow lines capable of handling the load in open Atlantic conditions. You need the weather to cooperate, at least enough to make the operation viable. And you need the ship being towed to hold together for the duration of the journey, which, with a vessel in the Alta's condition, was not guaranteed. The cost of chartering an ocean-going salvage tug for a multi-day operation several hundred miles offshore is substantial. The Irish government would be looking at a bill that could easily run into hundreds of thousands of euros, possibly more, for a ship that belonged to someone else and that no one wanted. There was no obvious mechanism for recovering that cost from the owner, who was unreachable. The Irish taxpayer would effectively be paying to clean up a mess made by an obscure Tanzanian shipping company that had apparently ceased to function. Sinking the vessel, scuttling it deliberately, sounds like the simple solution, and in some ways it is. A ship that has been scuttled in deep water is no longer a navigational hazard, no longer an environmental risk on the surface, no longer anyone's ongoing problem. But scuttling a vessel in international waters involves its own set of legal requirements. You need permission from the flag state. You need to ensure that the environmental impact is acceptable, which means, among other things, removing or neutralising any fuel oil or hazardous materials before the vessel goes down, so you are not creating an underwater pollution event in exchange for solving a surface hazard. The Alta had residual fuel in its bunker tanks. Removing that fuel from a compromised vessel in February Atlantic conditions, 700 miles offshore, is itself a complicated and costly operation. And the legal approvals required to scuttle a vessel that is not your own, registered under another country's flag, in international waters, those approvals take time to assemble. Time that the Atlantic was not going to wait for. The third option, leaving it, was the one that had been in effect for the past 16 months, and it had not exactly worked out well. The ship had drifted 3,000 miles. It was now close enough to the Irish coast to be a real and proximate danger. Leaving it further was not a serious option. So the Irish authorities were in the position of having to deal with a problem that was not theirs to deal with, using resources they had not budgeted for this purpose, under a legal framework that assigned responsibility to parties who were either unwilling or unable to meet it. This is, in a quieter way, one of the more frustrating aspects of the Alta's story. The ship had been adrift for over a year. Its position had been tracked. Maritime authorities in multiple countries had been aware of it as a hazard, and the response had been, essentially, to log it and monitor it and hope it resolved itself without hitting anything important. It had not resolved itself. It had resolved itself into Irish territorial waters, more or less. What the Irish government eventually decided was to arrange a tow. Not immediately. There were deliberations, there were contacts with Malta and with the Flag State Registry, there were assessments of the ship's condition and what would be required to move it safely. The Maritime Casualty Investigation Board was involved. The Marine Survey Office was involved. The question of who would pay and whether any recovery of costs from the owner was even theoretically possible was discussed. The practical answer to that last question was probably no, or at least not in any meaningful time frame. But the ship needed to be dealt with, and leaving it was not acceptable, and so a tow was what was going to happen. A salvage tug was dispatched. The plan was to bring the Alta under tow and move it to a port where it could be properly assessed and dealt with, the residual fuel pumped off, the wreck formally processed, the whole complicated situation brought to some kind of administrative resolution. It was not an elegant solution. It was an expensive, slow, logistically difficult solution to a problem that should never have existed in the first place. But it was a solution. What the Irish authorities and the salvage crew had not fully accounted for, or perhaps had accounted for and simply could not do anything about, was the weather. This is February in the North Atlantic. The weather in the North Atlantic in February does not arrange itself around the scheduling needs of maritime salvage operations. The same ocean system that had been pushing the Alta northeast for 15 months, that had been driving it through autumn gales and winter swells and the general hostility of the deep Atlantic in cold months, was not going to pause while a tug made its way out to the ship and got lines attached and began the slow process of bringing it in. The Alta had been lucky, in a strange way, to survive as long as it had. That luck, such as it was running out. A storm was moving in, and the tow, before it could be properly completed, was about to become something much more complicated than a routine salvage operation. The ship that had crossed an ocean alone, that had drifted through 15 months of open water without hitting anything, was about to discover that the Irish coast was very much something to hit. And it was not going to miss. The storm that moved in during those last days of February 2020 was not unusual for the North Atlantic at that time of year. It was not a historic event, not a named hurricane, not something that made international weather headlines. It was simply what the North Atlantic does in February. A deep low pressure system pushing up from the southwest, bringing strong winds, heavy swell, and the kind of deteriorating sea conditions that make any maritime operation significantly more dangerous and significantly more complicated. For a salvage tug trying to secure a tow line to a dead, drifting vessel in open water, those conditions were not merely inconvenient, they were potentially decisive. Getting a tow line onto a vessel like the Alta is not a simple procedure even in calm water. The ship has no functioning engine, which means it cannot hold its position. It cannot maneuver toward the tug or away from obstacles. It is essentially a passive object of nearly 2,000 gross tons, moving with the sea, responding only to wind and current. The tug has to approach carefully, get close enough to pass a line across, and then secure that line to the Alta's hull in a way that will hold under the strain of towing a heavy, dead vessel through open ocean conditions. All of this requires time, and it requires a sea state that allows the crews to work safely. In building weather, with swell increasing and wind picking up, the window for doing this well narrows quickly. The precise sequence of events during those final hours is not fully documented in the public record, at least not in granular detail. What is known is that the tow was attempted and that it did not hold. Whether the line parted under the strain of the worsening sea, or whether the connection was never fully secured before conditions made further work impossible, the outcome was the same. The Alta was no longer under tow. It was free again, in deteriorating weather, and it was no longer in the middle of the ocean with miles of open water in every direction. It was approximately 700 nautical miles west of Ireland when the Irish Navy had first boarded it. By now, after the deliberations and the arrangements and the failed tow attempt, it was considerably closer to land. The margin for error had shrunk dramatically. And the storm was pushing it east. There is something almost inevitable about what happened next, looking back at it. The ship had been moving northeast for 15 months. The North Atlantic Gaia had been carrying it in a broad, slow arc toward Europe. The Irish coastline was, in a sense, where the physics of the situation had always been pointing. The Alta had just been slower about getting there than anyone might have feared, and faster about getting there than anyone had time to prevent. With the tow failed and the storm driving it, the ship covered the remaining distance to the coast in a matter of hours. It had no way to stop. It had no anchor deployed that could hold in those conditions, and even if one had been dropped, a vessel of that size in those seas might drag it anyway. The shore was coming, and there was nothing to be done about it. The Alta ran aground near Ballycotton on the southwest coast of County Cork, sometime in the early hours of February 16th, 2020. Ballycotton is a small fishing village, a few hundred people, a harbour, a lighthouse on a small island just offshore that has been guiding ships away from these rocks since 1851. The lighthouse had been doing its job for nearly 170 years. The Alta, with no crew to read its signals and no engine to respond to them, was not in a position to benefit from that guidance. The ship came in on the storm swell and settled onto the rocks below the cliffs, listing slightly, its rusted hull grinding against the stone. People in Ballycotton woke up that morning to find a ship. A large, dark, rusted cargo vessel sitting on the rocks just offshore, as if it had simply decided to stop there. Some accounts suggest local residents were aware of the sound during the night, the low grinding and shifting of a large hull on rock, which is not a sound you hear often and is not one you forget. By morning the Alta was fully visible from the cliff tops, sitting at an angle in the swell, waves breaking around its hull, the grey Irish Sea moving around it with complete indifference. It was by any measure a striking sight. A 77-metre ship built in 1976 in Japan, flagged to Malta, owned by a company registered in Tanzania, carrying a cargo of crushed stone originally bound for Haiti, having spent 15 months drifting alone across the North Atlantic, now resting on the rocks of a small Irish fishing village in County Cork. The Irish Coast Guard and local emergency services responded quickly. There was, first and most urgently, the question of whether anyone was aboard. The answer, as it had been since October 2018, was no. The ship was empty. But an empty, grounded vessel still presents immediate risks, and those needed to be assessed without delay. The hull was compromised. The grounding had not helped a structure that was already weakened after 15 months of battering at sea, and the surf was continuing to work against it. The more pressing concern in the first hours was fuel. The Alta's bunker tank still contained residual fuel oil. A grounded vessel in surf with a compromised hull is a vessel that could begin leaking fuel into the sea at any point, and the coastline around Ballycotton is not a place where an oil spill would be a minor inconvenience. The rocky shoreline, the local marine environment, the proximity to a community that depends on the sea, all of it made the fuel situation the immediate priority. Assessments were made. The Irish Marine Survey Office and the relevant environmental authorities became involved. The fuel situation turned out to be manageable, in the sense that the Alta's residual fuel load was not enormous, and the hull had not yet begun leaking in a significant way. That was a relief, but it did not resolve the broader question of what was going to happen to the ship now that it was sitting on rocks a short distance from someone's home. The photographs that circulated in the following days were striking. Drone footage in particular gave a clear picture of the Alta's condition. The deep rust covering most of the hull, the worn and faded paint, the general look of a vessel that had been working hard for decades and had then spent over a year being slowly dismantled by the ocean. It sat at a slight angle against the rocks, the bow pointing roughly seaward, waves occasionally breaking over the lower parts of the hull. Behind it, the green hills of County Cork and the grey winter sky. It was the kind of image that photographs well, and it was picked up by media outlets across Ireland and internationally within a day or two. The term ghost ship, which had been used in maritime circles to describe the Alta during its long drift, now entered mainstream news coverage. People who had never heard of the MV Alta were suddenly looking at photographs of it and reading about its journey across the Atlantic with no crew aboard. There is something in that image, the rusted ship against the Irish coast, that clearly resonated with people. It is a visually arresting thing, and the story behind it is genuinely strange. A cargo ship abandoned in the mid-Atlantic in 2018, left adrift by an owner who apparently had no intention of recovering it, pushed across 3,000 miles of open ocean by currents and wind, boarded by the Irish Navy in the middle of the Atlantic, and then, after all of that, driven onto the rocks of a small Cork village by a February storm. It has the quality of a story that someone might make up, and the fact that it is entirely real and documented gives it an extra layer of strangeness. For the people of Ballycotton, the reaction was a mixture of things. There was genuine curiosity. This was an unusual event and people wanted to see it, to understand what had happened. There was some concern about the environmental implications, the fuel, the debris that would likely start washing ashore as the hull broke up. And there was perhaps a certain amount of the dry Irish humour that tends to surface in the face of the genuinely absurd. A ghost ship had washed up near their village. These things happen, apparently. What do you do with it? The Coast Guard maintained a presence. Access to the immediate area around the wreck was restricted for safety reasons. A compromised vessel in surf is not a stable environment, and the last thing anyone needed was an injury on top of everything else. The Marine Survey Office continued its assessment. Contact was made again with the Maltese Flag State Registry, again with whatever could be reached of Sudan Shipping Line, and again the response from the ownership side was essentially nothing. The company that had registered the Alta and then apparently walked away from it in the middle of the Atlantic was not going to materialise now to take responsibility for a grounded wreck on the Irish coast. The Irish authorities were once again left holding a problem that belonged to someone else. This time, at least, the problem was stationary. The Alta was not going anywhere further on its own. It was on the rocks of Ballycotton, and it was going to stay there until the sea took it apart or someone took deliberate action to remove it. And removal, given the ship's condition and location, was going to be extremely difficult and expensive. The hull was already weakened. Getting salvage equipment close enough to work on a vessel sitting in surf on a rocky shore is a complicated and dangerous operation. The cost-benefit calculation for attempting a full salvage was not favourable. The ship was old. It had no value as a working vessel. Its cargo was crushed stone. The cost of recovering it would far exceed anything that could be recouped. What the Irish authorities decided, in practical terms, was to focus on what could be done and accept what could not. The residual fuel in the bunker tanks was the priority, and efforts were made to pump it off before it became an environmental problem. That operation required working on a vessel in a difficult location in winter conditions, but it was manageable. The fuel was removed. The immediate risk of a significant oil spill was reduced. Beyond that, the ship was essentially left to the sea. It was structurally compromised, it was in surf, it was going to break apart. The aggregate cargo, the crushed stone that had been loaded in Greece in September 2018 and carried across the Atlantic without ever reaching Haiti, was going to wash out of the hold and onto the seabed and the local beaches. There was not much to be done about that. Crushed stone is not a toxic material. It would become part of the local shoreline. An odd kind of ending for a cargo that had travelled so far. In the days after the grounding, as the media attention settled and the immediate emergency response gave way to a longer-term management situation, there was time to take stock of what had actually happened. The tow had failed. The storm had driven the ship ashore. After 15 months of open ocean, the Alta had come to rest on the rocks of County Cork. The journey that had begun with an engine failure somewhere in the mid-Atlantic in October 2018 had ended here on a February morning in 2020, in a small Irish village that had not asked to be part of any of this. The crew of the LE Samuel Beckett, who had boarded the Alta in the open ocean 2 days earlier, had done their job professionally and carefully. The Irish Naval Service had responded to an unusual situation with the resources they had available. The tug that had attempted the tow had done what it could in worsening conditions. None of these people had failed in any obvious sense. The situation had simply been one where the forces involved, the storm, the sea state, the condition of the vessel, the distances involved, were larger than what the available response could manage in the time available. This is not an uncommon situation in maritime emergencies. The ocean is very large, and the resources that can be brought to bear on a problem in the middle of it are limited by geography and weather and logistics in ways that have not fundamentally changed, despite all the advances in maritime technology over the past century. What was left as February 2020 moved forward was a grounded wreck on the Cork coast, a community dealing with the aftermath of an unusual event, and a set of questions about environmental impact, cleanup, and responsibility that would take some time to work through. The Alta was not going to disappear quickly. It was going to sit there, in various stages of disintegration, for weeks and months. The sea was going to continue doing what the sea does to steel hulls on rocky shores. And the story of how it got there, the engine failure, the rescue, the abandonment, the 15-month drift, the Irish Navy boarding, the failed tow, the storm, was going to settle into the public record as one of the stranger maritime episodes of recent years. The grounding at Ballycotton was, in one sense, the end of the Alta's journey. The ship was not going to move again under its own power or anyone else's, but in another sense the story was not quite finished. The wreck was there. The community was there. The environmental questions were still open. The debris was beginning to wash ashore. And the broader questions that the Alta's story raised, about vessel abandonment, about the gaps in maritime law, about who is responsible when a ship is simply left in the ocean, those questions had not been answered by the ship running aground. If anything, they were about to become more visible. The morning after the Alta grounded near Ballycotton, people began arriving at the cliff tops and the shoreline to look at it. Some came because they had seen the news. Some came because word had spread through the village overnight, the way word spreads in small communities. A neighbour had seen it, or heard it, or someone's phone had lit up with a message from a cousin who worked with the Coast Guard. Ballycotton is a small place. A few hundred people live there. It sits on a headland on the south coast of County Cork, the kind of village where a large rusted cargo ship appearing on the rocks in the night is not something that gets processed quietly over morning tea. People came to see it for themselves, and what they saw was striking. The Alta sat tilted on the rocks, listing slightly to one side, its hull dark with rust and weathering. The accumulated grime of decades of working life, and then 15 months of open ocean with no maintenance, no crew, no care of any kind. The ship was not a sleek vessel, even in its working days. It was a utility ship, a workhorse, built in Japan in 1976 for the unglamorous business of carrying bulk cargo from one port to another. Now it was beached on the Cork coast, its hull streaked with rust in long vertical lines, the kind of rust that forms when a steel structure is left entirely to the elements for a long time. The paint that remained was faded and peeling. The superstructure, the raised section toward the stern where the bridge and crew quarters were housed, sat against the grey February sky, oddly intact given everything the ship had been through. The sea around it was not calm. February on the South Irish coast rarely is. Swells moved around the hull, breaking white against the rocks and the lower sections of the ship. The aggregate cargo in the hold, the crushed stone that had been loaded in Crete in September 2018, shifted with each wave, the weight of it settling further into the ship's compromised structure. The Alta was not going to be lifted off these rocks. That was clear to anyone looking at it. The question was not how to save it. The question was what it was going to do to the coastline as it came apart. Drone footage of the wreck began circulating online within hours. This was February 2020, and the world was on the edge of something that would soon consume almost all of its attention. The COVID-19 pandemic was already spreading, though most people in Ireland that morning were not yet fully aware of what was coming. For a brief window, the Alta was a genuine news story, not just in Ireland but internationally. The images were arresting in the way that images of ghost ships always are. There is something that catches the eye about a large vessel in a place where large vessels should not be. Tilted on rocks, clearly abandoned, clearly not going to move again. The photographs spread. News outlets in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and elsewhere picked up the story. The phrase ghost ship appeared in headlines around the world. The image of the Alta, dark hull, rusted sides, listing against the grey sea and the green Irish cliffs, became one of those images that travels quickly because it looks like something from a film, even though it is entirely real. Local residents had mixed feelings about the sudden attention. Ballycotton is a quiet place, and its community had woken up to find a large piece of international news sitting on their doorstep. The immediate concerns were practical ones. Was the ship going to leak fuel oil? Was the cargo going to wash ashore and damage the beach? Were there any structural hazards? Was the ship in danger of breaking apart suddenly, in a way that could be dangerous to anyone who came too close? The Irish Coast Guard had established a safety perimeter around the wreck. People were not supposed to approach it directly. The local Coast Guard station, which is one of the busier volunteer Coast Guard units in Ireland given the exposed nature of the Cork coastline, was closely involved in the initial response. The Irish Marine Survey Office, which operates under the Department of Transport, sent assessors to evaluate the wreck. The first priority, as it had been from the moment the ship grounded, was the fuel. The Alta carried residual heavy fuel oil in its bunker tanks, not a massive quantity, but enough to cause serious environmental damage to a stretch of coastline if it were released into the sea. Heavy fuel oil is a particularly damaging substance in a marine environment. It is thick, persistent, and difficult to clean up once it spreads. The coastline around Ballycotton includes important habitats. Seabirds nest in the area, and the waters support local marine life. An oil spill here would have been a significant environmental event, and the Irish authorities were not prepared to let it happen if it could be prevented. The process of pumping fuel from a grounded listing vessel in surf conditions is not simple. It requires specialist equipment and careful work to avoid making the situation worse. But it was done. Over the days following the grounding, fuel oil was successfully removed from the Alta's tanks. The immediate risk of a major spill was reduced substantially. This was probably the most consequential practical action taken in response to the grounding, and it was done efficiently given the circumstances. It did not make the news in the way that the dramatic images of the beached ship did, but it mattered considerably more for the long-term outcome. Beyond the fuel, the environmental assessment was cautious but not catastrophic. The aggregate cargo, crushed stone, is not a toxic material. It would wash out of the hold as the ship broke apart, and it would settle on the seabed and on local beaches, but it would not poison anything. It would change the local seabed composition in a small area. It would add debris to the shoreline, but it was not going to cause the kind of environmental crisis that a chemical cargo or a large oil spill would have caused. In that respect, the Alta's cargo was almost accidentally appropriate for the situation. A ship carrying crushed stone breaking apart on an Irish coast is a lesser environmental event than many other scenarios that could have played out. The media attention, in the meantime, was considerable. Journalists and photographers made their way to Ballycotton. Drone operators filmed the wreck from above and from the sea. The images were striking from every angle. The long dark hull against the pale winter sea, the cliffs behind it, the tilted superstructure. Some of the aerial footage showed the full length of the ship quite clearly, and it gave a sense of the scale of the thing. 77 metres is not enormous by the standards of modern shipping. It is a relatively small cargo vessel, but on a rocky shore near a small village, it is a very large object indeed. It dwarfed the landscape around it in a way that made the photographs feel slightly surreal. Reporters reached out to maritime experts, to Coast Guard officials, to local residents. The story that emerged in the coverage was broadly accurate, if sometimes simplified. The Alta had lost its engine in the Atlantic, the crew had been rescued, the ship had drifted for over a year, the Irish Navy had found it, a tow had been attempted, a storm had intervened, and now the ship was on the rocks. The phrase ghost ship was used freely, and it was not entirely wrong. The ship had crossed the Atlantic with no one aboard, which is as close to a ghost ship as the modern world actually produces. But the coverage sometimes leaned into a slightly more supernatural framing than the facts required. The Alta was not mysterious in the way of the Mary Celeste, where the crew's disappearance was never explained. The Alta's story was entirely documented. Every stage of it was known and accounted for. It was strange, but it was strange in a very practical, logistical, maritime law kind of way, which is perhaps less cinematic but no less interesting. Local residents who spoke to journalists generally expressed a combination of astonishment and pragmatic concern. One thing that came through in several accounts was the sheer unexpectedness of waking up to find a large ship on the rocks near your home. The South Cork coast is not unfamiliar with maritime history. The area around Cork Harbour has centuries of it, and the Lusitania sank not far offshore in 1915. But a ghost ship appearing in February 2020 was not something anyone had anticipated. One resident described looking out from the cliff top and simply not being able to process what they were seeing for a moment, because a large rusted cargo ship sitting on the rocks near Ballycotton was not something that fit into any normal category of expected events. The Irish Naval Service was measured in its public statements. The L.E. Samuel Beckett had done its job. The boarding party had investigated the vessel. The tow had been attempted in difficult conditions. The storm had made completion of the tow impossible. These were the facts stated plainly. There was no suggestion of failure on the part of the naval crew or the tug operators. The situation had been a difficult one, and the outcome, a grounded ship, was unfortunate but not the result of any error that could have been easily avoided. The naval vessel itself was unharmed. The Maritime Casualty Investigation Board, which is the Irish body responsible for investigating serious maritime incidents, would in due course examine the events surrounding the Alta's grounding. This is standard procedure in Irish maritime law when a vessel comes to grief in Irish waters or involves Irish assets. The investigation would look at the sequence of events, the decisions made, the conditions encountered, and whether any lessons could be drawn. These investigations are not about assigning blame in a criminal sense. They're about understanding what happened and whether procedures or resources or regulations could be improved to prevent similar outcomes. The Alta's case was unusual enough that it warranted careful examination. In the village of Ballycotton itself, the days after the grounding settled into something that mixed the extraordinary with the everyday in the way that communities absorb unusual events. The ship was there. People could see it from certain vantage points. Visitors were coming to look at it, which is not entirely unwelcome in a small coastal community in the off-season, though the circumstances were not ideal. The Coast Guard perimeter kept people at a safe distance from the wreck itself. Local businesses noted the unusual traffic. The weather continued to be what February weather on the South Irish coast tends to be. Changeable, often grey, occasionally stormy. Each storm that passed through the area worked on the Alta's hull. The ship was already structurally compromised when it grounded. 15 months of open ocean without maintenance had done considerable damage to a vessel that was already old and worn when it was abandoned. The surf on the rocks worked on the hull plating. The aggregate cargo shifted in the hold with each wave, the weight of it grinding against the ship's interior structure. Steel that had been weakened by corrosion began to give way in places. The process of a ship breaking apart on a rocky shore is not usually dramatic. It is slow and grinding, happening incrementally over weeks and months, each storm taking a little more. But it is thorough. The sea is patient in a way that no salvage operation can match. The aggregate cargo began washing out of the hold as the hull opened up. Crushed stone moved with the tides, settling on the seabed around the wreck and washing onto nearby beaches in small quantities. It was not a dramatic event. There was no sudden collapse, no explosion of cargo. It was gradual. The stone that had been loaded in Crete, intended for construction in Haiti, that had crossed the Atlantic in a ship with no crew, was now becoming part of the seabed off County Cork. It is difficult to know what to make of that as a fact, except to note that it's one of the more unlikely journeys a load of crushed stone has ever made. The environmental monitoring that Irish authorities maintained in the weeks after the grounding did not reveal any major oil release. The fuel removal operation had been effective. There was some debris, pieces of hull material, equipment, miscellaneous items from the ship's interior that washed ashore and had to be cleared. Local volunteers and council workers dealt with this as it came in. It was an inconvenience rather than a crisis. The coastline near Ballycotton was not devastated by the Alta's presence. It was altered slightly, in ways that would take some time to fully assess. But the worst outcomes that had been feared in the immediate aftermath of the grounding did not materialise. What was left, as the initial intensity of the media coverage faded and the practical response moved into a longer-term monitoring phase, was a community living alongside a wreck that was slowly being absorbed by the sea. The Alta was still visible. It would remain visible for some time, but it was no longer news in the same urgent way. The world's attention had moved on, and very soon the world would have considerably larger things to attend to. The pandemic that had been building in the background would, within weeks, change almost everything about daily life across Ireland and most of the rest of the world. The Alta, which had briefly been an internationally recognised image, would become a local story again. But locally, the questions that the grounding had raised were not going away. What was the full environmental impact? Who was going to bear the cost of monitoring and any necessary cleanup? What about the wreck itself? As it broke apart, what debris would remain and for how long? These were not dramatic questions, but they were real ones, and they pointed towards something larger than one ship on one stretch of coast. The Alta had arrived at Ballycotton as the end result of a chain of decisions and failures and indifferences that stretched back through 15 months of open ocean, and before that, to a shipping office in Tanzania, and a flag registry in Malta, and an engine room somewhere in the mid-Atlantic in October 2018. The wreck on the rocks was the visible end of that chain, but the chain itself, the system that had produced this outcome, was still very much in place, still operating, still capable of producing similar results elsewhere. The Alta was not the first ship to end up abandoned in the ocean, and it was not going to be the last. What its story actually revealed about the broader world of maritime shipping, about the gaps and pressures and structural problems that made something like this possible, was a question worth sitting with for a little while longer. So let us stay with the wreck for a moment, and look more carefully at what actually happened to the Alta once it was aground on those rocks near Ballycotton. The Marine Survey Office of Ireland, which operates under the Department of Transport, took the lead on the formal assessment of the ship's condition. Their concern in the immediate days after the grounding was primarily practical and urgent. The Alta was carrying residual fuel oil in its bunkers, the tanks that held the heavy fuel used by the ship's main engine and auxiliary generators. This was not a fully loaded fuel supply. The Alta had been at sea for 15 months with no engine running, and whatever fuel had remained after the original engine failure had been sitting in those tanks ever since, slowly degrading, the tanks themselves corroding from the outside. The exact quantity of residual fuel aboard was not immediately known, but even a relatively modest amount of heavy bunker oil released into the sea near a rocky coastline can cause significant damage to marine life, seabirds, and the intertidal zone. The coastline near Ballycotton is not a sterile stretch of industrial shoreline. It is a living coastal environment with rocky reefs and kelp beds and the kind of bird life that depends on clean water and uncontaminated shoreline. The urgency of the fuel assessment was genuine. A specialist marine salvage team was brought in to evaluate the situation and carry out what is called a counter-pollution operation. Essentially, pumping whatever fuel remained in the Alta's tanks off the ship before the hull deteriorated further and released it into the water naturally. This kind of operation is technically demanding under any circumstances. Doing it on a vessel that is already grounded, partially listing, structurally compromised, and being worked on by Atlantic surf makes it considerably more so. The salvage team had to access the fuel tanks through a ship that was not stable, using equipment brought across by small craft from the shore or from a support vessel standing off the wreck. The conditions in February off the South Irish coast are not forgiving. There were weather windows to work with, and there were periods when conditions made the work impossible, and the team had to wait. The fuel removal was carried out over several days. The amount recovered was not publicly specified in precise detail, but Irish authorities confirmed that the operation was successful in removing the primary pollution risk. No major oil release occurred. That was, given the circumstances, a genuinely good outcome, one that required skilled work under difficult conditions and one that was not guaranteed when the ship first grounded. The environmental monitoring that followed in the weeks afterward did not reveal any significant contamination of the surrounding water or shoreline attributable to the Alta's fuel. That piece of the story at least resolved without the worst happening. The structural condition of the ship was a different matter. Once the immediate pollution risk was addressed, the question of what to do with the wreck itself became the central problem, and here the options narrowed quickly. Salvaging the Alta, meaning refloating it, repairing it to a seaworthy state, and moving it to a port, was not a realistic possibility. The ship was already old and worn before it was abandoned. 15 months of unmaintained drift in the open Atlantic had accelerated the corrosion and deterioration of the hull, the machinery spaces, and the structural members throughout the vessel. When it grounded hard on rocks. The impact and the ongoing action of the surf on the hull caused further structural damage in the days and weeks that followed. The Marine Survey Office's assessment was that the ship was not salvageable in any practical or economically rational sense. Towing it off the rocks as a complete unit was also not feasible. A vessel in that condition, in those sea states, cannot simply be attached to a tug and pulled free without risking breaking apart entirely in the process. There was also the question of where it would be towed to, who would pay for that, and what would happen to it once it arrived somewhere. The owner, Sudan Shipping Line, was effectively absent from the conversation. There was no party willing to take financial responsibility for the wreck. The Irish state had not created this situation and was not legally obliged to fund a full salvage operation for a foreign-flagged vessel abandoned by its owner. The costs involved in a proper salvage of even a small cargo ship run into hundreds of thousands of euros at minimum, and for a wreck in this condition, in these waters, the cost would be substantially higher and the outcome far from certain. The decision that was effectively reached, not as a formal announcement but as a practical reality, was that the Alta would be left to break apart where it lay, with monitoring in place to manage any environmental issues that emerged from that process. It was not a satisfying conclusion in any neat administrative sense, but it was the honest one given the circumstances, and the sea did what the sea does. Over the weeks that followed the grounding, each storm that moved through the area worked on the Alta's hull. The ship had been resting on a rocks at an angle, with the surf hitting it repeatedly, and the combined effect of wave action, the weight of the aggregate cargo shifting inside the hold, and the structural weakness already present in the corroded steel meant that the hull began to open up in sections. This is not a dramatic, cinematic process. It does not happen all at once in a single spectacular collapse. It is gradual. Plates separate at the seams, frames buckle, sections of the outer hull peel away from the internal structure. Water enters spaces that had previously been sealed. The ship becomes less and less a coherent object, and more a collection of heavy components slowly being redistributed by the ocean. The aggregate cargo, the crushed stone, the gravel-like material that had been loaded in Crete in September 2018, began to wash out of the hold as the hull opened. Aggregate is not a toxic material. It is not going to poison the water or kill marine life in any direct sense. But several thousand tons of crushed stone moving out of a broken hull and settling on a rocky seabed does change that seabed. It covers existing reef structures, displaces the organisms living on them, and alters the local underwater landscape in ways that take time to fully understand. The aggregate spread outward from the wreck site with the tidal currents, some of it settling immediately around the hull, some of it washing into shallower areas closer to shore. Small quantities of stone appeared on nearby beaches, not in amounts that would bury the beach, but enough to be noticeable, enough to be collected and remarked upon by people walking the shoreline. Irish environmental authorities, including the Environmental Protection Agency and local council bodies, maintained monitoring of the area around the wreck through the spring and into the summer of 2020. Water quality sampling, visual inspection of the intertidal zone, observation of bird populations in the area. These were the tools of that monitoring. The picture that emerged was not one of ecological catastrophe. The absence of a significant oil spill, which had been the primary environmental concern, meant that the marine environment near Ballycotton was not subjected to the kind of acute contamination that can cause rapid and visible damage. The slower, more diffuse effects of the aggregate dispersal and the debris from the breaking hull were real but manageable in scale. Debris did wash ashore, and it kept coming for some time. Pieces of steel plating, sections of pipe and cable, items from the ship's interior, equipment, fittings, materials from the accommodation spaces. Some of this was large enough to be a hazard on the beach, and local authority workers and volunteers dealt with it as it came in. It was the kind of ongoing, unglamorous work that does not make headlines, but that someone has to do, and the community around Ballycotton handled it with the matter-of-fact practicality that tends to characterise how coastal communities deal with the sea's behaviour. The sea gives things, and the sea takes things, and sometimes it deposits large quantities of rusted steel on your local beach, and you deal with it. There is something quietly ironic about the cargo, when you think about it for a moment. The aggregate that was washing onto Irish beaches and settling into the seabed off County Cork had been loaded onto the Alta in Crete, with the intention of being used for construction in Haiti. Haiti, which had been devastated by the 2010 earthquake and was in the middle of an extended rebuilding process, had ordered material for construction, the kind of basic, unglamorous building material that goes into foundations and roads, and the physical infrastructure of a place trying to rebuild itself. The Alta had been hired to carry that material across the Atlantic. It never arrived. The engine failed, the crew was rescued, and the ship drifted for 15 months before ending up on rocks off the south coast of Ireland. The aggregate that was meant to help rebuild something in Haiti became part of the seabed off a small Irish fishing village. That is not a moral lesson or a metaphor, exactly. It is just a fact, and it is a strange one. The cost of the entire response, the counter-pollution operation, the fuel removal, the environmental monitoring, the debris clearance, was borne primarily by the Irish state and by Cork County Council. The figure was not trivial, though the exact total cost across all agencies involved was not consolidated into a single public number. Estimates based on the component operations suggest the overall expense ran into the hundreds of thousands of euros. No contribution came from the ship's owner. Sudan Shipping Line did not engage meaningfully with Irish authorities during the response or afterward. The company's registered address in Tanzania did not produce a responsive contact. The flag state, Malta, had obligations under international maritime conventions to ensure that the owner of a Maltese-flagged vessel met their responsibilities, but the practical levers available to a flag state in a situation like this, where the owner is essentially unreachable and has no significant assets, are limited. The costs were absorbed by the public bodies that had no choice but to respond. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is one of the clearest illustrations of how the economics of maritime abandonment actually work. When a ship is abandoned, whether at sea, in a port, or on a beach, the costs do not disappear. They are simply transferred. The owner, by absconding from responsibility, passes those costs to whoever is left holding the situation. In the case of the Alta, that was the Irish state, Irish local government, and by extension Irish taxpayers. The owner had already extracted whatever economic value the ship had to offer during its working life, and when that value was exhausted and the ship became a liability, the liability was simply walked away from. The system as it exists does not have a reliable mechanism for preventing this. It happens with the Alta, and it happens, in less dramatic but structurally similar ways, with other vessels in other places with some regularity. By the time the spring of 2020 arrived, the Alta was substantially broken apart. The main hull structure was no longer intact. What remained on the rocks near Ballycotton was a collection of heavy steel sections, increasingly separated from each other, the recognisable form of a ship giving way to something more like an industrial debris field. At low tide, the remains were visible from the shore. At high tide, much of what remained was submerged. Drone footage taken in the weeks and months after the grounding documented this process of disintegration. The images showing the progressive loss of the ship's form, the hull section separating, the internal structure becoming exposed as the outer plating fell away. The aggregate on the seabed around the wreck site would remain there indefinitely. Crushed stone does not dissolve, it does not biodegrade. It settles, and over time the marine environment adjusts around it. Organisms colonize new surfaces, sediment accumulates, the altered seabed becomes, slowly, a new kind of normal. The steel sections of the hull would corrode over years and decades, becoming artificial reef structure of a sort, though an unplanned and undesirable one. The sea has a way of incorporating things, eventually even things that were never meant to be there. What the Alta left behind at Ballycotton was not just a physical wreck and a dispersed cargo. It left behind a set of questions that the community and the authorities dealing with the aftermath had to sit with. Questions about who is responsible when a ship is abandoned and its owner cannot be found. Questions about what international maritime law can actually enforce in practice, as opposed to what it says on paper. Questions about the cost of cleaning up after an industry that operates across jurisdictions and under flags of convenience, and through layers of corporate structure that make accountability genuinely difficult to establish. The Alta's grounding made these questions concrete and local, in a way that abstract discussions of maritime law do not. A real ship, on real rocks, costing real money to deal with no one to send the bill to. The wreck also raised questions about environmental responsibility that went beyond this particular ship. The monitoring carried out around Ballycotton in the months after the grounding was thorough by the standards of what was possible, but it was also reactive. It was responding to a situation that had already occurred rather than preventing it. The regulatory framework that was supposed to prevent a ship like the Alta from being abandoned in the first place had failed. The question of how to strengthen that framework, how to make the consequences of abandonment fall more reliably on the parties responsible for it, rather than on the communities and governments left to deal with the aftermath, was not one that the Alta's grounding could answer. It could only make the question harder to ignore. The story of what happened to the Alta's physical remains is, in a sense, the least complicated part of the whole account. Ships break apart. The sea takes them. That part is straightforward enough. What is less straightforward, and what the Alta's case puts in front of you in an unusually clear way, is the system that produced the wreck in the first place. The chain of decisions and structures and gaps in accountability that allowed a 77-metre cargo ship to be abandoned in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with no plan for what would happen to it. That system did not break down with the Alta. It continued operating, and the Alta was simply one visible result of how it operates. Understanding that system, the world of vessel abandonment, of flags of convenience, of shipping companies that exist more as legal constructs than as accountable entities, is what the Alta's story is really pointing toward. So let us stay with that system for a moment, because the Alta is not the only story of its kind. It is in many ways the most visually dramatic version of a problem that plays out in quieter, less photographed ways all the time. The International Transport Workers Federation, the ITF, a global union federation that monitors conditions for workers in the shipping industry, publishes data on vessel abandonment each year. The numbers are not small. In 2020, the year the Alta grounded at Ballycotton, the ITF recorded over 85 cases of seafarer abandonment globally. In 2021, that number rose to over 100 cases. These are not ships drifting unmanned across the Atlantic. They are more commonly ships sitting in ports with crews still aboard, unpaid, unable to leave, waiting for an owner who has effectively disappeared. The ship becomes a kind of floating trap. The crew cannot be repatriated because there is no money to pay for their flights. They cannot leave the vessel without risk of losing whatever back wages they might eventually recover. They sit, sometimes for months, in foreign ports, dependent on the ITF and local port welfare organisations for food and basic supplies. The Alta's crew were rescued before they experienced this particular version of abandonment, which is something. But the world they worked in is one where this outcome, being left aboard a failing vessel by an owner who has run out of money or interest or both, is not a rare edge case. It is a recognised occupational hazard. The Maritime Labour Convention of 2006, usually referred to as the MLC 2006, was designed in part to address exactly this. It came into force in 2013, and it set minimum standards for seafarer working conditions, including provisions requiring ship owners to carry financial security, essentially insurance, that would cover the cost of repatriation if a vessel was abandoned and the owner could not pay. The MLC has been ratified by a large number of countries, covering the vast majority of the world's shipping tonnage. On paper, it represents a meaningful attempt to close the gap between the obligations that maritime law places on ship owners and the practical ability of those owners to meet those obligations. In practice, the picture is more complicated. Enforcement of the MLC depends heavily on port state control, the system by which ships are inspected when they call at foreign ports. If a ship never enters a port where inspectors are looking carefully, or if the inspections that do occur are cursory, the protections the MLC offers can remain theoretical. Flag states, the countries whose flags vessels fly, are supposed to ensure that ships registered under their flag comply with the MLC and other international conventions. But flag states vary enormously in how seriously they take this responsibility. Some flag states maintain rigorous inspection regimes and genuine regulatory oversight. Others function primarily as registries. They collect fees, issue documentation, and do relatively little else. The distinction matters enormously when something goes wrong. The practice of flying a flag of convenience, registering a ship in a country other than the one where the owner actually operates, in order to take advantage of lower fees, less stringent regulation, or more favourable tax treatment, has been a feature of the shipping industry since at least the early 20th century. Panama was one of the first countries to develop an open registry, offering foreign ship owners the ability to register vessels under the Panamanian flag without any meaningful connection to Panama. Other countries followed: the Marshall Islands, Liberia, the Bahamas, Cyprus, Malta. These are among the most common flags of convenience today, and together they account for a substantial portion of the world's merchant fleet. The Alta flew the Maltese flag. Malta is, it should be said, a member of the European Union and maintains a more active regulatory presence than some open registries. But the fundamental structure of the flag of convenience system, where the economic relationship between a ship and its flag state is primarily financial rather than substantive, creates conditions in which accountability can become genuinely difficult to establish. The ownership structure of vessels registered under flags of convenience is often layered in ways that make it hard to identify who is ultimately responsible for a ship. A vessel might be owned by a holding company in one jurisdiction, managed by a ship management company in another, chartered to an operator in a third, and crewed through a crewing agency based somewhere else entirely. Each layer of this structure serves legitimate purposes, separating operational risk, managing tax exposure, accessing specialized expertise. But the cumulative effect is that when something goes wrong, the question of who is responsible can become genuinely contested. The Alta's registered owner, Sudan Shipping Line Limited, was based in Tanzania. Whether that company had meaningful assets, whether it had directors who could be held accountable, whether it had insurance that could be called upon, these questions prove difficult to answer in any practical sense. The company appears to have been, by the time the Alta grounded, essentially a shell with no resources and no responsive presence. This is not unusual. Ships at the end of their economic lives are frequently owned by companies with minimal assets, because the ships themselves are the primary asset, and when the ship is no longer valuable, when it requires expensive repairs, when its cargo earnings no longer cover its operating costs, when it becomes a liability rather than an investment, the incentive structure for the owner shifts. Continuing to operate the ship means spending money. Arranging proper disposal, selling it to a scrapping yard, paying for its decommissioning, costs money too. Simply walking away costs nothing, at least for the owner. The costs are externalized. They fall on the crew, on port authorities, on coastal communities, on governments that have no choice but to respond when a rusted hull appears on their shoreline. The shipbreaking industry, which handles the end-of-life disposal of vessels, is itself a world of significant complexity and in some cases significant ethical concern. The major shipbreaking yards are located in South Asia, in Alang, India, in Chittagong, Bangladesh, in Gadani, Pakistan. These yards dismantle ships manually, largely on tidal beaches, in conditions that have historically involved serious occupational hazards and significant environmental contamination. Steel, asbestos, toxic paints, residual fuel, heavy metals. A ship at end of life contains a substantial quantity of hazardous materials, and the process of breaking it apart releases those materials into the surrounding environment, if not managed carefully. The economics of shipbreaking are driven by the price of scrap steel, which fluctuates significantly. When steel prices are high, ships have residual value, and owners have an incentive to send them to breaking yards. When steel prices are low, that incentive weakens, and the temptation to abandon a vessel rather than pay for its proper disposal increases. There are international conventions that govern the ship recycling process. The Hong Kong Convention, adopted in 2009, was intended to establish minimum standards for safe and environmentally sound ship recycling. But the Hong Kong Convention had not entered into force as of 2020, the year the Alta grounded, because it had not been ratified by a sufficient number of countries with sufficient shipping tonnage. The regulatory gap it was meant to close remained open. Ships continued to be broken apart in conditions that the convention was designed to prevent, or, in cases like the Alta, abandoned before they even reached a breaking yard. The Alta was, in some sense, a ship that the system had finished with. It had been built in Japan in 1976, worked for over 4 decades carrying goods across various ocean routes, passed through multiple owners, and by 2018 was a 42-year-old vessel with a failing engine and a cargo of gravel destined for one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. The economics of its final voyage, whatever they were, did not work out. The engine failed, the crew was rescued. The owner made no meaningful effort to recover the ship. And the ship, left to its own devices, did something that no one planned for and that the system had no real mechanism for preventing. It drifted for 15 months across the Atlantic Ocean and washed up on a rocky Irish shore. What makes the Alta's case worth examining carefully is not just the drama of the grounding, or the striking images of a rusted hull against grey Irish cliffs, but what it reveals about the gap between how the maritime regulatory system is supposed to work and how it actually works in practice. The obligations are written down, the conventions exist, the flag state system has a logic to it. But the system depends on enforcement, and enforcement depends on resources, and resources depend on political will, and political will is often insufficient when the parties most affected by poor enforcement, seafarers, coastal communities, port authorities in developing countries, do not have significant lobbying power relative to the economic interests that benefit from the current arrangement. The ITF and other maritime labour and safety organisations have been making these arguments for decades. They are not new arguments. The Alta did not reveal a problem that no one knew about. What it did was make the problem visible in a very specific, very concrete way. A 77-metre ship, on the rocks, in a country with a free press and a functioning legal system, with photographs circulating internationally and journalists asking questions. In that sense, the Alta was unusual, not because the underlying conditions that produced it were rare, but because the outcome was visible in a way that most vessel abandonments are not. A ship abandoned in a port in West Africa, or left to rust in an anchorage in Southeast Asia, does not generate international media coverage. A ship that drifts across the Atlantic and beaches itself near a picturesque Irish fishing village does. There are other notable cases that provide context for where the Alta sits in the broader landscape of vessel abandonment. The MV Lyubov or Lova, a Russian cruise ship, was cut loose from a tow in 2013 and drifted into the North Atlantic, generating considerable concern about where it might end up. It was never definitively located and is presumed to have sunk. The SS American Star, a former ocean liner, ran aground off the Canary Islands in 1994 after breaking free from a tow, and its rusting hulk remained partially visible for years before it finally slipped beneath the surface. These are the cases that attract attention. Large vessels, dramatic circumstances, striking imagery. But behind them sits a much larger and quieter population of vessels that are simply walked away from, in ports and anchorages around the world, without ever generating a news story. The Alta is, in this sense, representative of something larger than itself. It is an extreme and unusually well-documented instance of a dynamic that the shipping industry and the international regulatory framework have not yet found a satisfactory way to address. The ship crossed an ocean alone and ended up on a rocky shore, and the costs of dealing with that outcome fell on people and institutions that had no connection to the decisions that produced it. The owner benefited from the ship's working life and bore none of the cost of its end. That asymmetry is not unique to the Alta. It is built into the structure of how the industry operates. None of this is to say that the shipping industry as a whole is defined by bad actors or deliberate wrongdoing. The vast majority of ships are operated responsibly, their crews are paid, their maintenance is maintained, and when they reach the end of their useful lives, they are disposed of through legitimate channels. The industry moves an extraordinary volume of goods across the world's oceans every day, and most of that movement happens without incident. But the cases at the margins, the ships operated by undercapitalized companies on thin margins with minimal regulatory oversight, reveal where the system's protections are weakest. The Alta was a marginal ship, operated by a marginal company, on a marginal route. The regulatory system that might have prevented its abandonment was present in theory, but absent in practice, and the result was 15 months of unguided drift across the North Atlantic, followed by a grounding on the coast of County Cork, followed by a slow disintegration on the rocks near Ballycotton. The aggregate cargo that the Alta was carrying when it left Crete in September 2018 was destined for Haiti. It never arrived. It sat in the hold of a drifting ship for over a year, crossed the Atlantic in the wrong direction, and ended up on the seabed off the coast of Ireland. There is something in that detail, the cargo that travelled thousands of miles and arrived nowhere, that captures something about the Alta's story more broadly. The ship was in motion for a very long time, but none of that motion was purposeful. It was the motion of something that had been set adrift and left to the currents. And the currents, as it turned out, had their own ideas about where things should end up. What the Alta's case leaves you with, when you look at it through the lens of the broader system, rather than just the individual ship, is a question about what accountability actually means in an industry that operates across international boundaries under flags of convenience, through layers of corporate structure, with regulatory oversight that varies enormously from one jurisdiction to the next. The answer, at least as the Alta's story illustrates it, is that accountability can be very thin indeed. Thin enough that a 77-metre cargo ship can be abandoned in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the responsible party can simply disappear, leaving the costs to be distributed among whoever happens to be standing nearby when the consequences arrive. That is not a mystery. It is a structural feature. And the Alta drifting northeast on the currents of the North Atlantic was one consequence of that structure becoming visible in a way that was impossible to ignore. Which brings us back to the ship itself, to the physics of what it actually did during those 15 months at sea, and to the quiet, almost improbable fact of its survival. So, let us return to the ship itself. Not to the law, not to the industry, not to the systemic failures that made the Alta's abandonment possible, but to the physical object, the 77-metre hull, the rusting steel, the hold full of crushed stone, the thing that actually crossed the ocean. Because when you strip away the legal complexity and the regulatory shortcomings and the corporate opacity, what you are left with is a genuinely strange physical fact. A dead ship, no engine, no crew, no rudder control, no guidance of any kind, survived 14 to 15 months in the North Atlantic Ocean. It travelled somewhere in the range of 3,000 miles, possibly more depending on how you trace the path of its drift. It crossed one of the busiest shipping corridors in the world. It passed through waters that, in autumn and winter, are among the most hostile on the planet. And it arrived, more or less intact, on the coast of Ireland. That is not something that was supposed to happen. And quietly, among people who understand the North Atlantic well, there was a degree of genuine astonishment that it did. Start with the conditions. The North Atlantic in late 2018 and through 2019 was not a gentle environment. It rarely is. The autumn and winter seasons in the North Atlantic are characterised by a succession of deep, low-pressure systems that move eastward across the ocean, generating sustained winds and significant wave heights on a regular basis. The Beaufort scale, which measures wind force from 0 to 12, sees frequent readings of force 7, 8 and 9 in the North Atlantic during winter. That is near gale, and severe gale conditions, with wind speeds ranging from roughly 28 to 55 miles per hour and wave heights that can reach 6, 8, 10 metres and beyond. These are not abstract numbers. A 10-metre wave is roughly the height of a 3-storey building. In a storm system, those waves do not arrive one at a time. They arrive in sequences from multiple directions with irregular timing. A ship with a functioning engine and an experienced crew can manage these conditions by maintaining steerage, by keeping the bow pointed into the waves, adjusting speed and heading to reduce the forces acting on the hull. A dead ship cannot do any of that. It sits wherever the water and the wind put it. Its orientation relative to the waves is determined not by a helmsman, but by the shape of the hull, the distribution of weight aboard, and the direction of the prevailing sea. In the worst case, a vessel caught beam on to large waves, that is, with its side facing the wave direction, can be rolled, flooded, or overwhelmed. It is one of the more dangerous positions a ship can find itself in, and a drifting vessel has essentially no ability to avoid it. The Alta survived this repeatedly over more than a year. That is the part that is genuinely hard to fully account for. One factor that likely helped is the cargo. The Alta was carrying aggregate, crushed stone, gravel, the kind of bulk material used in construction. It is dense, heavy, and it sits low in the hold. When the Alta lost its crew and its engine in October 2018, that cargo was still aboard, and the weight of it, distributed through the lower portion of the ship's hull, would have given the vessel a relatively low centre of gravity. In naval architecture, a low centre of gravity is associated with what is called positive metacentric height, a measure of a ship's tendency to return to an upright position after being heeled over by a wave or a wind gust. In plain terms, a ship with a low centre of gravity is harder to capsize than one riding high and light. The Alta, laden with stone, was sitting deep in the water. That may sound like a disadvantage. A lower freeboard means waves wash over the deck more easily. But in terms of stability, it may have been one of the things that kept the ship alive. There is a small specific irony in this. The aggregate cargo that the Alta was carrying to Haiti, the cargo that never arrived, that sat in the hold for 15 months of unguided drift, may have been, in a practical sense, the thing that allowed the ship to survive the journey. The weight that made the voyage purposeful also made the drift survivable. The stone that was meant to build something in Haiti ended up, in a way, preserving the ship that was carrying it. That is the kind of detail that you could not invent. The currents also deserve some attention, because the Alta's drift was not random in the way that the word drifting might suggest. The North Atlantic is crossed by a system of large semi-permanent circulation patterns that move surface water in broadly predictable directions. The Gulf Stream, which originates in the Gulf of Mexico and flows northeastward along the eastern coast of North America, is the most well-known of these. It carries warm water at speeds that can reach 4 or 5 miles per hour in its core, and it transitions as it moves into the open Atlantic into the broader North Atlantic current. This current continues the northeastern movement of water across the open ocean, eventually splitting, some of it moving toward northern Europe and the British Isles, some of it curving back southward in what becomes the Canary Current. The Alta, abandoned approximately 1,380 miles southeast of Bermuda, was sitting in a position where these currents, combined with the prevailing westerly winds of the mid-latitudes, would naturally push a drifting object in a broadly northeastern direction, which is, in fact, the direction the Alta went. It did not drift randomly. It was carried in a rough and irregular way, along a path that the physics of the ocean essentially prescribed. The North Atlantic gyre, the large, slow, clockwise rotation of water in the North Atlantic basin, was doing what it always does. The Alta was simply an unusually large object being moved by it. This does not make the survival any less remarkable. The currents provide a general direction, but they do not smooth out the storms. They do not prevent collisions. They do not keep the hull sealed. The Alta still had to physically survive everything the ocean put in front of it, month after month, without anyone aboard to pump bilges, inspect the hull, adjust ballast, or respond to any developing problem. And the collision question is worth sitting with for a moment. The North Atlantic is a busy ocean. The shipping lanes between Europe and North America are among the most heavily trafficked in the world. Container ships, bulk carriers, tankers, gas carriers, passenger vessels, all moving on relatively predictable routes across the same body of water. The Alta, with no AI signal, no running lights, and no radar reflector operating, was essentially invisible to the automated systems that modern ships use to track and avoid other vessels. It was a dark object on a dark ocean. At night, in poor visibility, in the kind of conditions that the North Atlantic regularly produces, It would have been extremely difficult to see on radar and essentially impossible to see by eye until you were very close. The fact that the Alta drifted for 15 months without being struck by another vessel is, in itself, a significant piece of luck. Maritime collision incidents do occur in the North Atlantic, though they are relatively rare given the volume of traffic. A 77-metre hull drifting unpowered and unlit across busy shipping lanes represents a genuine hazard, and the absence of a collision during that entire period is not something that can be fully explained by the physics of the currents. It is to some extent simply fortunate. Some maritime observers noted this with a kind of quiet disbelief. Not that the ship drifted so far, but that it did so without hitting anything or being hit. There were occasional sightings during the drift period. The Alta appeared on the radar of passing vessels at various points. Some of these contacts were logged and reported. Maritime authorities were aware that there was an unlit, unpowered vessel somewhere in the North Atlantic, and it was listed as a navigational hazard in notices to mariners, the formal advisories that shipping companies use to alert vessels to known dangers along their routes. But the Alta's position was not precisely known at any given moment. It had no functioning AIS transponder broadcasting its location. Tracking it was a matter of inference, taking known current patterns and wind data and estimating where a drifting object of that size and draft might have moved since the last confirmed sighting. It is not a precise science. The Alta was, for much of its drift, somewhere in a large area of ocean rather than at a specific, known position. This is part of what made the Irish Navy's encounter in February 2020 feel, to those who had been tracking the situation, like something between relief and surprise. The ship had been out there, somewhere, for a long time, and here it was, still afloat, still largely intact, 700 nautical miles west of the Irish coast, having completed what amounted to a transatlantic crossing under no power and with no crew. The word that keeps coming up when people who understand maritime operations talk about the Alta's drift is remarkable, not in a theatrical sense, not as a word chosen for effect, but as a genuine descriptor of something that exceeded what most experienced observers would have predicted. A dead ship in the North Atlantic in autumn and winter is not expected to last 15 months. It is expected to take on water through a failing hull seal, or to be overwhelmed in a severe storm, or to be driven onto a shoal or a reef, or simply to sink quietly in deep water with no one to witness it. The Alta did none of these things. It kept going. Part of that may be explained by the construction era. The Alta was built in Japan in 1976, at a time when cargo ship construction involved substantial steel scantlings, that is, the thickness and weight of the steel used in the hull plating and structural members. Ships built in that era were often described as overbuilt by modern standards. Contemporary vessels are engineered more precisely, with material thicknesses calculated closer to minimum requirements, because steel is heavy and expensive, and every unnecessary kilogram costs money over a ship's working life. Older ships, built when the calculations were more conservative and the cost pressures somewhat different, sometimes had hulls that were simply heavier and thicker than strictly necessary. This does not make them indestructible, but it may give them a degree of structural reserve, a buffer against the gradual deterioration that comes from years of use and neglect, that a more precisely engineered vessel would not have. Whether this played a role in the Alta's survival is speculative, but it is a reasonable piece of the picture. The aggregate cargo, the low centre of gravity, the construction era, the particular path of the currents, the absence of a collision, the statistical luck of not encountering a storm severe enough to overwhelm the hull, all of these things contributed, in varying and unknowable proportions, to the fact that the Alta arrived off the coast of Ireland still floating. Strip away any one of them and the outcome might have been different. The ship might have sunk in the mid-Atlantic in January 2019, during one of the winter storm systems that moved through the area. It might have been struck by a container vessel on a Liverpool to New York run. It might have taken on enough water through a failing hull fitting to settle slowly beneath the surface somewhere in the open ocean, with no one to notice and no wreck to find. Instead, it kept going, for 14 months, for 15 months, through autumn, through winter, through spring, through another summer, into another autumn, and then into another winter. The seasons changed. The crew members who had been evacuated returned to their lives, to their families, to other ships, to whatever came next. The owner company receded into corporate invisibility. The maritime authorities logged the hazard and updated their estimates of its position. And the Alta moved, slowly and without purpose, in the direction the ocean was taking it. There is something almost meditative about that image, if you let yourself sit with it. Not romantic. The Alta was not a beautiful ship, and its drift was not a voyage in any meaningful sense. It was an abandoned object being moved by forces it could not resist. But there is something in the sheer duration of it, in the months of silent movement through one of the world's most powerful and indifferent environments, that is hard to look at without feeling some version of quiet astonishment. The ship did not know it was crossing the Atlantic. It did not know it was surviving storms. It did not know it was becoming, in the language of maritime incident reporting, a navigational hazard of interest to naval vessels and Coast Guard agencies across multiple countries. It was just there, in the water, moving. And then, in February 2020, it stopped moving, or rather, it stopped drifting, because something interrupted the drift. The Irish Navy found it. And what happened after that encounter is where the Alta's long, strange, solitary journey finally began to come to an end. The ship had survived the ocean. What it could not survive in the end was the coast. By mid-2020, not much remained of the MV Alta that you could call a ship. The hull had broken apart in the surf near Ballycotton section by section in the weeks and months following the grounding. What had once been a 77-metre working vessel, Japanese-built, Maltese-flagged, loaded with crushed stone and moving under its own power between ports, was now a scatter of rusted steel, broken plating and debris distributed across a small stretch of the Irish coastline. At low tide, for months afterward, structural remnants were still visible from the shore. Twisted frames, sections of the outer hull, the kind of wreckage that makes the ocean's patience feel very long and human engineering feel very temporary. The aggregate cargo, the crushed stone that had been loaded in Crete in September 2018 and was bound for Haiti, washed ashore in pieces over those same weeks. Pale grey gravel, unremarkable on its own, now mixed into the beach near a small Irish fishing village. It had travelled from Greece to the mid-Atlantic, sat at the bottom of a cargo hold through 14 months of open ocean drift, survived storms and currents and the entire crossing, and arrived, not in Port-au-Prince, not unloaded by crane into waiting trucks, but here on a County Cork beach, distributed by waves across a stretch of sand and rock. It never reached the place it was meant to go. It ended up somewhere no one planned for it, having made a journey no one intended. There is something in that detail that is hard to fully articulate. It is not tragic exactly. It is just strange. Quietly, specifically strange. The 14 crew members who had been evacuated by the United States Coast Guard in October 2018 were, by all accounts, safe. They had been lifted off the stricken vessel, transported to safety, and returned to their lives. Most were Indian and Ukrainian nationals, seafarers working the kind of unglamorous cargo routes that keep global trade moving and that rarely attract much public attention. When the Alta became international news in February 2020, when the photographs of the rusted hull beached against the Irish rocks circulated around the world, those 14 men were living their lives somewhere else. Some may have taken other ships, some may have left the sea entirely. Their names do not appear prominently in the public record of the Alta's story. They were the people the ship was built around, its reason for existing in a practical sense. And yet the story that captured the world's attention was the story of the ship without them. No one was prosecuted in connection with the Alta's abandonment. The owner company, Sudan Shipping Line Limited, registered in Tanzania, appears to have made no meaningful effort to recover the vessel after the crew evacuation, and to have offered no meaningful response to the Irish authorities when the ship was found. Whether the company still exists in any functional sense is unclear. The beneficial ownership of vessels registered under flags of convenience is often deliberately opaque, and tracing actual accountability through layers of shell companies and nominee directors is, in practice, extremely difficult. The people who owned the Alta, in whatever legal sense ownership applied, faced no consequences that are part of the public record. The ship was abandoned, it drifted, it wrecked, it broke apart, and the people responsible for it moved on or disappeared into corporate abstraction, or simply were never clearly identified in the first place. This is not unusual. That is the part that stays with you if you spend time looking into how maritime abandonment actually works. The Alta is an extreme case, a ship left in open ocean rather than in a port, drifting for over a year rather than sitting idle at a berth. But the underlying dynamic of owners walking away from vessels and leaving crews, costs and consequences for others to absorb is documented and recurring. The International Transport Workers Federation tracks cases of seafarer abandonment every year, and the numbers are not small. The Maritime Labour Convention of 2006 was designed to create clearer obligations and better protections, and it has helped in some respects. But enforcement depends on flag states taking their responsibilities seriously, and flag states operating under the convenience model have a structural incentive not to look too closely at the vessels flying their flags. Malta, in the Alta's case, was the flag state. Malta has a large and professionally administered ship registry by the standards of the industry, but even well-run registries struggle to enforce obligations against owners who have no meaningful assets in accessible jurisdictions and no intention of cooperating. The result is a gap, not a secret gap, not a hidden one. Maritime lawyers and union officials and shipping journalists know it well, but a gap that persists because closing it requires international coordination and political will that have not quite materialised in the way the problem demands. The Alta fell through that gap in a particularly visible and dramatic way. Most vessels that are abandoned do not drift across the Atlantic and wash up on European coastlines with international media attention. Most of them sit in ports, or on beaches in South Asia, or in anchorages off the coasts of countries with limited resources to deal with them. The Alta was unusual in the manner of its ending. The conditions that produced it were not unusual at all. What the Alta leaves behind, then, is not really a mystery. The facts of the case are documented. The ship was abandoned in the mid-Atlantic in October 2018 after an engine failure. It drifted northeast for roughly 14 to 15 months, carried by the North Atlantic gyre and the prevailing winds. It was found by the Irish Navy in February 2020, approximately 700 nautical miles west of Ireland. It was driven aground near Ballycotton, County Cork, during a storm. It broke apart. The cargo washed ashore. No one was prosecuted. The owner company vanished. These are the facts, and they are sufficient to explain what happened. But the story of the Alta is not really a story about facts, or rather, it is a story about facts that somehow add up to something that feels larger than any individual fact can account for. A ship that crosses the Atlantic with no one on board, through one of the world's most demanding ocean environments in autumn and winter for over a year, and arrives at a small Irish village. There is something in the accumulation of those details that sits differently than a straightforward maritime incident report would suggest. Part of it is the duration. 14 months is a long time. It is long enough for seasons to change twice. It is long enough for people to move on, for the incident to be logged and noted and periodically updated, and then, in the daily press of maritime administration, somewhat set aside. The Alta was a hazard on a list. It was an entry in a tracking system. And then it was there, off the coast of Ireland, still intact, having travelled thousands of miles in the interim. The gap between the abstract entry in a database and the physical reality of a 77-metre rusted vessel in Atlantic swells is the gap where the strangeness lives. Part of it is the solitude. Not solitude in a poetic sense. The ship had no inner life, no experience of being alone, but the physical fact of an object that size moving through an environment that size with no human presence aboard. The North Atlantic in winter is not a comfortable place. Wave heights in significant storms regularly exceed 10 metres. Wind speeds in the Beaufort scale's higher ranges, force 10, force 11, produce conditions that experienced seafarers describe with a kind of careful respect. The Alta moved through those conditions or around them, or simply endured them, without anyone aboard to watch, to worry, to make decisions, to pump bilges or adjust ballast or do any of the 1,000 small things that a crew does to keep a ship alive in difficult water. It was just the ship and the ocean did not care, and the ship, for reasons that are partly explicable and partly just fortunate, did not sink. There is also something in the destination. The Alta ended its journey not in a salvage yard, not at a breaker's beach in Bangladesh or Pakistan where old ships go to be dismantled by hand, not in a port where paperwork would be filed and ownership disputes would be resolved through legal processes. It ended on a rocky shore near Ballycotton, a small fishing village in County Cork, Ireland. Ballycotton has a lighthouse, it has a harbour, it has a few hundred residents. It is the kind of place that has its own quiet history, its own rhythms, its own relationship with the sea. And then one morning in February 2020 it had a ghost ship on its rocks. The juxtaposition is almost too neat. But it happened. The world is occasionally like that. The people of Ballycotton watched the Alta break apart over the following weeks. They watched the debris wash onto their beaches. They dealt with the environmental monitoring, the Coast Guard presence, the media attention that came and then, as media attention does, moved on to other things. The ship that had been a global news story for a few days became, for the people living nearest to it, a local matter, a wreck to be assessed, monitored, gradually absorbed by the sea and the shore. By the time most of the world had forgotten about the Alta, Ballycotton was still living with the remnants of it. The aggregate cargo, the crushed stone that had started this whole journey, is now part of the seabed near that small village. It travelled from a quarry or a processing facility somewhere in Greece, was loaded onto a ship in Crete, crossed the Atlantic, sat in a drifting hull for over a year, and was finally deposited on an Irish coastline. The people in Haiti who were expecting it never received it. Whether that shipment was ever replaced, whether the project it was destined for was completed by other means, is not part of the public record of the Alta's story. The stone arrived somewhere, just not where it was supposed to go. If you're looking for a lesson in the Alta's story, there are a few available. There is a lesson about maritime law and the gaps in accountability that vessel abandonment exposes. There is a lesson about ocean physics, about how currents and winds and hull stability interact in ways that are partly predictable and partly not. There is a lesson about the logistics of global trade, about the invisible infrastructure of cargo ships and the human beings who crew them, and about what happens when that infrastructure fails and the people responsible for it are nowhere to be found. But the Alta's story does not feel, in the end, like a story that is primarily about lessons. It feels more like a story about the world being larger and stranger than the systems we build to manage it. Maritime law exists, ship registries exist, insurance frameworks exist, international conventions exist. And still, a 77-metre cargo vessel spent 14 months crossing the Atlantic with no one on board, and no one stopped it, and no one was held responsible, and it ended up on a beach in Ireland, not because the systems failed dramatically. There was no catastrophic breakdown, no corruption scandal, no deliberate crime that has been proven. The systems just did not quite reach. The ship was in the space between them. That space is real. It exists in maritime law, and in other places too. In the gaps between jurisdictions, between corporate structures, between what is legally required and what is practically enforced. The Alta made that gap visible in an unusually dramatic way, but the gap was there before the Alta and it remains after it. What stays with you, listening to this story at whatever hour you're listening, in whatever place you find yourself tonight, is not really the drama of it. The grounding was dramatic, and the boarding party climbing onto a rusted listing ship in Atlantic swells was dramatic, and the photographs of the hull against the Irish cliffs were striking. But what lingers is something quieter. The image of a ship moving through dark water for 14 months, unhurried and unguided, carrying its cargo of crushed stone toward a shore it did not know was waiting. The 14 crew members somewhere on land, living their lives. The owner company unreachable. The ocean doing what the ocean does, indifferent and patient and immense. The MV Alta was not a romantic ship. It was old and rusted and unglamorous, and it ended badly, broken on rocks near a small fishing village, its cargo scattered across the seabed. But it crossed the Atlantic alone, and that is a fact that is genuinely hard to set aside. Not because it means something exactly, but because it happened. The world is full of things that happen without anyone intending them, without anyone watching, without anyone to record them as they occur. The Alta's crossing was one of those things, witnessed only by the ocean, and then, eventually, by an Irish naval vessel on a February morning, and then by the rest of us, looking at photographs of a rusted hull on a grey coastline, trying to understand what we were seeing. Thank you for spending this time here. If the Alta's story stayed with you the way it has stayed with me, please consider leaving a like. It helps this channel more than you might think, and it lets me know that these quieter, slower stories are worth telling. If you are new here, welcome. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you, and I would be glad to have you along for them. Subscribe if you would like to be here when the next one arrives. Rest well wherever you are tonight. The ocean is still out there, moving in the dark, carrying whatever it carries.